Welcome to Narrated Books, where stories come to life, full audiobooks and engaging book summaries. Listen, learn, and explore new worlds through the power of books.
20,000 Leagues Under the Seas by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 15. Accident or Incident. The next day, March 22nd, at 6 o'clock in the morning, preparations for departure began. The last gleams of twilight were melting into the night. The cold was brisk. The constellations were glittering with startling intensity. The wonderful Southern Cross, polar star of the Antarctic regions, twinkled at its zenith. The thermometer marked -12 degrees centigrade, and a fresh breeze left a sharp nip in the air. Ice floes were increasing over the open water. The sea was starting to congeal everywhere. Numerous blackish patches were spreading over its surface, announcing the imminent formation of fresh ice. Obviously, this southernmost basin froze over during its 6-month winter and became utterly inaccessible. What happened to the whales during this period? No doubt they went beneath the ice bank to find more feasible seas. As for seals and walruses, they were accustomed to living in the harshest climates and stayed in these icy waterways. These animals know by instinct how to gouge holes in the ice fields and keep them continually open. They go to these holes to breathe. Once the birds have migrated northward to escape the cold, these marine mammals remain the sole lords of the polar continent. Meanwhile, the ballast tanks filled with water and the Nautilus sank slowly. At a depth of 1,000 feet, it stopped. Its propellers churned the waves, and it headed due north at a speed of 15 miles per hour. Near the afternoon, it was already cruising under the immense frozen carapace of the ice bank. As a precaution, the panels in the lounge stayed closed, because the Nautilus's hull could run afoul of some submerged block of ice. So I spent the day putting my notes into final form. My mind was completely wrapped up in my memories of the pole. We had reached that inaccessible spot without facing exhaustion or danger, as if our seagoing passenger carriage had glided there on railroad tracks. And now we had actually started our return journey. Did it still have comparable surprises in store for me? I felt sure it did. So inexhaustible is this series of underwater wonders. As it was, in 5.5 months since fate had brought us on board, we had cleared 14,000 leagues, and over this track, longer than the Earth's equator, so many fascinating or frightening incidents had beguiled our voyage. The hunting trip in Crespo forests, our running aground in the Torres Strait, the coral cemetery, the pearl fisheries of Ceylon, the Arabic Tunnel, the fires of Santorini, those millions in the Bay of Vigo, Atlantis, the South Pole. During the night, all these memories crossed from one dream to the next, not giving my brain a moment's rest. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by a violent collision. I sat up in bed, listening in the darkness, and then was suddenly hurled into the middle of my stateroom. Apparently, the Nautilus had gone aground, then heeled over sharply. Leaning against the walls, I dragged myself down the gangways to the lounge, whose ceiling lights were on. The furniture had been knocked over. Fortunately, the glass cases were solidly secured at the base and had stood fast. Since we were no longer vertical, the starboard pictures were glued to the tapestries, while those to port had their lower edges hanging a foot away from the wall. So the Nautilus was lying on its starboard side, completely stationary to boot. In its interior I heard the sound of footsteps and muffled voices, but Captain Nemo didn't appear. Just as I was about to leave the lounge, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What happened?" I instantly said to them. "I came to ask Master that," Conseil replied. "Damnation!" the Canadian explained. "I know full well what happened. The Nautilus has gone aground, and judging from the way it's listing, I don't think it'll pull through like the first time in the Torres Strait." "But," I asked, "are we at least back on the surface of the sea?" "We have no idea," Conseil replied. "It's easy to find out," I answered. I consulted the pressure gauge. Much to my surprise, it indicated a depth of 360 meters. "What's the meaning of this?" I exclaimed. "We must confer with Captain Nemo," Conseil said. "But where do we find him?" Ned Land asked. "Follow me," I told my two companions. We left the lounge. Nobody in the library, nobody by the central companionway or the crew's quarters. I assumed that Captain Nemo was stationed in the pilot house. Best to wait. The three of us returned to the lounge. I'll skip over the Canadian's complaints. He had good grounds for an outburst. I didn't answer him back, letting him blow off all the steam he wanted. We had been left to ourselves for 20 minutes, trying to detect the tiniest noises inside the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He didn't seem to see us. His facial features, usually so emotionless, revealed a certain uneasiness. He studied the compass and the pressure gauge in silence, then went and put his fingers on the world map at a spot in the sector depicting the southernmost seas. I hesitated to interrupt him, but some moments later, when he turned to me, I threw back at him a phrase he had used in the Torres Strait. "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir," he replied. "This time an accident. Serious? Perhaps. Is there any immediate danger?" "No." "The Nautilus has run aground?" "Yes." "And this accident came about?" "Through nature's unpredictability, not man's incapacity. No errors were committed in our maneuvers. Nevertheless, we can't prevent a loss of balance from taking its toll. One may defy human laws, but no one can withstand the laws of nature." Captain Nemo had picked an odd time to philosophize. All in all, this reply told me nothing. "May I learn, sir," I asked him, "what caused this accident?" "An enormous block of ice, an entire mountain, has toppled over," he answered me. "When an iceberg is eroded at the base by warmer waters or by repeated collisions, its center of gravity rises. Then it somersaults. It turns completely upside down. That's what happened here. When it overturned, one of these blocks hit the Nautilus as it was cruising under the waters. Sliding under the hull, this block then raised us with irresistible power, lifting us into less congested strata, where we now lie on our side." "But can't we float the Nautilus clear by emptying its ballast tanks to regain our balance?" "That, sir, is being done right now. You can hear the pumps working. Look at the needle on the pressure gauge. It indicates that the Nautilus is rising. But this block of ice is rising with us, and until some obstacle halts its upward movement, our position won't change." Indeed, the Nautilus kept the same heel to starboard. No doubt it would straighten up once the block came to a halt. But before that happened, who knew if we might not hit the underbelly of the ice bank and be hideously squeezed between two frozen surfaces? I mused on all the consequences of this situation. Captain Nemo didn't stop studying the pressure gauge. Since the toppling of this iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet. Suddenly, a slight movement could be felt over the hull. Obviously, the Nautilus was straightening a bit. Objects hanging in the lounge were visibly returning to their normal positions. The walls were approaching the vertical. Nobody said a word. Hearts pounding, we could see and feel the ship righting itself. The floor was becoming horizontal beneath our feet. 10 minutes went by. "Finally, we're upright," I exclaimed. "Yes," Captain Nemo said, heading to the lounge door. "But will we float off?" I asked him. "Certainly," he replied, "since the ballast tanks aren't empty yet. And when they are, the Nautilus must rise to the surface of the sea." The captain went out, and soon I saw that at his orders the Nautilus had halted its upward movement. In fact, it soon would have hit the underbelly of the ice bank, but it had stopped in time and was floating in mid-water. "That was a close call," Conseil said. "Yes. We could have been crushed between these masses of ice, or at least imprisoned between them. And then, with no way to renew our air supply—" "Yes, that was a close call." "If it's over with," Ned Land muttered. I was unwilling to get into a pointless argument with the Canadian and didn't reply. Moreover, the panels opened just then, and the outside light burst through the uncovered windows. We were fully afloat, as I have said, but on both sides of the Nautilus, about 10 meters away, there rose dazzling walls of ice. There also were walls above and below. Above, because the Ice Bank's underbelly spread over us like an immense ceiling. Below, because the somersaulting block, shifting little by little, had found points of purchase on the both side walls and had gotten jammed between them. The Nautilus was imprisoned in a genuine tunnel of ice about 20 meters wide and filled with quiet water. So the ship could easily exit by going either ahead or astern, sinking a few hundred meters deeper, and then taking an open passageway beneath the ice bank. The ceiling lights were off, yet the lounge was still brightly lit. This was due to the reflecting power of the walls of ice, which threw the beams of our beacon right back at us. Words cannot describe the effects produced by our galvanic rays on these huge, whimsically sculptured blocks, whose every angle, ridge, and facet gave off a different glow depending upon the nature of the veins running inside the ice. It was a dazzling mine of gems, in particular sapphires and emeralds, whose jets of blue and green crisscrossed. Here and there, opaline hues of infinite subtlety raced among sparks of light that were like so many fiery diamonds, their brilliance more than any eye could stand. The power of our beacon was increased 100-fold, like a lamp shining through biconvex lenses of a world-class lighthouse. "How beautiful," Conseil explained. "Yes," I said, "it's a wonderful sight, isn't it, Ned?" "Oh, damnation, yes," Ned Land shot back. "It's superb. I'm furious that I have to admit it. No one has ever seen the like. But this sight could cost us dearly. And in all honesty, I think we're looking at things God never intended for human eyes." Ned was right. It was too beautiful. All at once, a yell from Conseil made me turn around. "What is it?" I asked. "Master must close his eyes. Master mustn't look." With that, Conseil clapped his hands over his eyes. "But what's wrong, my boy?" "I've been dazzled, struck blind." Involuntarily, my eyes flew to the window, but I couldn't stand the fire devouring it. I realized what had happened. The Nautilus had just started off at great speed. All the tranquil glimmers of the ice walls had then changed into blazing streaks. The sparkles from these myriad of diamonds were merging with each other. Swept along by its propeller, the Nautilus was traveling through a sheath of flashing light. Then the panels in the lounge closed. We kept our hands over our eyes, which were utterly saturated with those concentric gleams that swirl before the retina when the sunlight strikes too intensely. It took some time to calm our troubled vision. Finally, we lowered our hands. "Ye gods, I never would have believed it," Conseil said. "And I still don't believe it," the Canadian shot back. "When we return to shore, jaded from all these wonders," Conseil added, "think how we'll look down on those pitiful land masses, those puny works of man. No, the civilized world won't be good enough for us." Such words from the lips of this emotionless Flemish boy showed that our enthusiasm was near the boiling point. But the Canadian didn't fail to throw his dram of cold water over us. "The civilized world," he said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, Conseil, my friend. We're never going back to that world." By this point, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Just then there was a collision in the Nautilus's bow. I realized that its spur had just bumped a block of ice. It must have been a faulty maneuver, because this underwater tunnel was obstructed by such blocks and didn't make for easy navigating. So I had assumed that Captain Nemo, in adjusting his course, would go around each obstacle or would hug the walls and follow the winding of the tunnel. In either case, our forward motion wouldn't receive an absolute check. Nevertheless, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus definitely began to move backwards. "We're going astern?" Conseil said. "Yes," I replied. "Apparently the tunnel has no way out at this end." "And so?" So, I said, our maneuvers are quite simple. We'll return in our tracks and go out the southern opening. That's all. As I spoke, I tried to sound more confident than I really felt. Meanwhile, the Nautilus accelerated its backward movement, and running with propeller in reverse, it swept us along at great speed. "This'll mean a delay," Ned said. "What are a few hours more or less, so long as we get out?" "Yes," Ned Land repeated, "so long as we get out." I strolled for a little while from the lounge into the library. My companions kept their seats and didn't move. Soon I threw myself down on a couch and picked up a book, which my eyes skimmed mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Conseil approached me, saying, "Is it deeply fascinating, this volume Master is reading?" "Tremendously fascinating," I replied. "I believe it. Master is reading his own book." "My own book?" Indeed, my hands were holding my own work on the great ocean depths. I hadn't even suspected. I closed the book and resumed my strolling. Ned and Conseil stood up to leave. "Stay here, my friends," I said, stopping them. "Let's stay together until we're out of this blind alley." "As Master wishes," Conseil replied. The hours passed. I often studied the instruments hanging on the lounge wall. The pressure gauge indicated that the Nautilus stayed at a constant depth of 300 meters. The compass, that it kept heading south. The log, that it was traveling at a speed of 20 miles per hour, an excessive speed in such a cramped area. But Captain Nemo knew that by this point there was no such thing as too fast, since minutes were now worth centuries. At 8:25 a second collision took place, this time astern. I grew pale. My companions came over. I clutched Conseil's hand. Our eyes questioned each other, and more directly than if our thoughts had been translated into words. Just then the captain entered the lounge. I went to him. "Our path is barred to the south?" I asked him. "Yes, sir. When it overturned, that iceberg closed off every exit. We're boxed in?" "Yes." End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. Shortage of air. Consequently, above, below, and around the Nautilus there were impenetrable frozen walls. We were the Ice Bank's prisoners. The Canadian banged a table with his fearsome fist. Conseil kept still. I stared at the captain. His face had resumed its usual emotionlessness. He crossed his arms. He pondered. The Nautilus did not stir. The captain then broke into speech. "Gentlemen," he said, in a calm voice, "there are two ways of dying under the conditions in which we are placed." This inexplicable individual acted like a mathematics professor working out a problem for his pupils. "The first way," he went on, "is death by crushing. The second is death by asphyxiation. I don't mention the possibility of death by starvation because the Nautilus's provisions will certainly last longer than we will. Therefore, let's concentrate on our chances of being crushed or asphyxiated." "As for asphyxiation, Captain," I replied, "that isn't a cause for alarm because the air tanks are full." "True," Captain Nemo went on, "but they'll supply air for only 2 days. Now then, we've been buried beneath the waters for 36 hours, and the Nautilus's heavy atmosphere already needs renewing. In another 48 hours our reserve air will be used up. Well then, Captain, let's free ourselves within 48 hours. "We'll try to at least, by cutting through one of these walls surrounding us." "Which one?" I asked. "Borings will tell us that. I'm going to ground the Nautilus on the lower shelf. Then my men will put on their diving suits and attack the thinnest of these ice walls." "Can the panels in the lounge be left open?" "Without ill effect. We're no longer in motion." Captain Nemo went out. Hissing sounds soon told me that water was being admitted into the ballast tanks. The Nautilus slowly settled and rested on the icy bottom at a depth of 350 meters, the depth at which the lower shelf of ice lay submerged. "My friends," I said, "we are in a serious predicament, but I'm counting on your courage and energy." "Sir," the Canadian replied, "this is no time to bore you with my complaints. I'm ready to do anything I can for the common good." "Excellent, Ned," I said. extending my hand to the Canadian. "I might add," he went on, "that I'm as handy with a pick as a harpoon. If I can be helpful to the captain, he can use me any way he wants." "He won't turn down your assistance. Come along, Ned." I led the Canadian to the room where the Nautilus's men were putting on their diving suits. I informed the captain of Ned's proposition, which was promptly accepted. The Canadian got into his underwater costume and was ready as soon as his fellow workers. Each of them carried on his back a Rouquayrol device that the air tanks had supplied with a generous allowance of fresh oxygen, a considerable but necessary drain on the Nautilus's reserves. As for the Ruhmkorff lamps, they were unnecessary in the midst of these brilliant waters, saturated with our electric rays. After Ned was dressed, I re-entered the lounge, whose windows had been uncovered. Stationed next to Conseil, I examined the strata surrounding and supporting the Nautilus. Some moments later we saw a dozen crewmen set foot on the shelf of ice, among them Ned Land, easily recognized by his tall figure. Captain Nemo was with them. Before digging into the ice, the captain had to obtain borings, to ensure working in the best direction. Long bores were driven into the side walls, but after 15 meters, the instruments were still impeded by the thickness of those walls. It was futile to attack the ceilings, since that surface was the ice bank itself, more than 400 meters high. Captain Nemo then bored into the lower surface. There we were separated from the sea by a 10-meter barrier. That's how thick the iceberg was. From this point on, it was an issue of cutting out a piece equal in surface area to the Nautilus's waterline. This meant detaching about 6,500 cubic meters, to dig a hole through which the ship could descend below this tract of ice. Work began immediately and was carried on with tireless tenacity. Instead of digging all around the Nautilus, which would have entailed even greater difficulties, Captain Nemo had an immense trench outlined on the ice 8 meters from our port quarter. Then his men simultaneously staked it off at several points around its circumference. Soon their picks were vigorously attacking this compact matter, and huge chunks were loosened from its mass. These chunks weighed less than the water, and by an unusual effect of specific gravity, each chunk took wing, as it were, to the roof of the tunnel, which thickened above by as much as it was diminished below. But this hardly mattered so long as the lower surface kept growing thinner. After 2 hours of energetic work, Ned Land re-entered, exhausted. He and his companions were replaced by new workmen, including Conseil and me. The Nautilus's chief officer supervised us. The water struck me as unusually cold, but I warmed up promptly while wielding my pick. My movements were quite free, although they were executed under a pressure of 30 atmospheres. After 2 hours of work, re-entering to snatch some food and rest, I found a noticeable difference between the clean, elastic fluid supplied me by the Rouquayrol device and the Nautilus's atmosphere, which was already charged with carbon dioxide. The air hadn't been renewed in 48 hours, and its life-giving qualities were considerably weakened. Meanwhile, after 12 hours had gone by, we had removed from the outlined surface area a slice of ice only 1 meter thick, hence about 600 cubic meters. Assuming the same work would be accomplished every 12 hours, it would still take 5 nights and 4 days to see the undertaking through to completion. 5 nights and 4 days, I told my companions, and we have oxygen in the air tanks for only 2 days. Without taking into account, Ned answered, that once we're out of this damned prison we'll still be cooped up beneath the ice bank, without any possible contact with the open air. An apt remark, for who could predict the minimum time we would need to free ourselves? Before the Nautilus could return to the surface of the waves, couldn't we all die of asphyxiation? Were this ship and everyone on board doomed to perish in this tomb of ice? It was a dreadful state of affairs, but we faced it head-on, each one of us determined to do his duty to the end. During the night, in line with my forecasts, a new 1-meter slice was removed from this immense socket. But in the morning, wearing my diving suit, I was crossing through the liquid mass in a temperature of -6 degrees to -7 degrees centigrade, when I noted that little by little the side walls were closing in on each other. The liquid strata farthest from the trench, not warmed by the movements of workmen and tools, were showing a tendency to solidify. In the face of this imminent new danger, what would happen to our chances for salvation, and how could we prevent this liquid medium from solidifying, then cracking the Nautilus's hull like glass? I didn't tell my two companions about this new danger. There was no point in dampening the energy they were putting into our arduous rescue work, but when I returned on board, I mentioned this serious complication to Captain Nemo. "I know," he told me, in that calm tone the most dreadful outlook couldn't change. "It's one more danger, but I don't know any way of warding it off. Our sole chance of salvation is to work faster than the water solidifies. We've got to get there first, that's all." Get there first. By then I should have been used to this type of talk. For several hours that day I wielded my pick doggedly. The work kept me going. Besides, working meant leaving the Nautilus, which meant breathing the clean oxygen drawn from the air tanks and supplied by our equipment, which meant leaving the thin, foul air behind. Near evening 1 more meter had been dug from the trench. When I returned on board, I was well nigh asphyxiated by the carbon dioxide saturating the air. Oh, if only we had the chemical methods that would enable us to drive out this noxious gas! There was no lack of oxygen. All this water contained a considerable amount, and after it was decomposed by our powerful batteries, this life-giving elastic fluid could have been restored to us. I had thought it all out, but to no avail, because the carbon dioxide produced by our breathing permeated every part of the ship. To absorb it, we would need to fill containers with potassium hydroxide and shake them continually. But this substance was missing on board, and nothing else could replace it. That evening Captain Nemo was forced to open the spigots of his air tanks and shoot a few spouts of fresh oxygen through the Nautilus's interior. Without this precaution, we wouldn't have awakened the following morning. The next day, March 26, I returned to my miner's trade, working to remove the 5th meter. The ice banks, side walls, and underbelly had visibly thickened. Obviously they would come together before the Nautilus could break free. For an instant I was gripped by despair. My pick nearly slipped from my hands. What was the point of this digging if I was to die smothered and crushed by this water turning to stone, a torture undreamed of by even the wildest savages? I felt like I was lying in the jaws of a fearsome monster, jaws irresistibly closing. Supervising our work, working himself, Captain Nemo passed near me just then. I touched him with my hand and pointed to the walls of our prison. The starboard wall had moved forward to a point less than 4 meters from the Nautilus's hull. The captain understood and gave me a signal to follow him. We returned on board. My diving suit removed, I went with him to the lounge. "Professor Aronnax," he told me, "this calls for heroic measures, or we'll be sealed up in this solidified water as if it were cement." "Yes," I said, "but what can we do?" "Oh," he exclaimed, "if only my Nautilus were strong enough to stand that much pressure without being crushed." "Well?" I asked, not catching the captain's meaning. "Don't you understand," he went on, "that the congealing of this water could come to our rescue? Don't you see that by solidifying it could burst these tracts of ice imprisoning us, just as its freezing can burst the hardest stones? Aren't you aware that this force could be the instrument of our salvation rather than our destruction?" "Yes, Captain, maybe so, but whatever resistance to crushing the Nautilus may have, it still couldn't stand such dreadful pressures, and it would be squashed as flat as a piece of sheet iron." "I know it, sir. So we can't rely on nature to rescue us, only our own efforts. We must counteract this solidification. We must hold it in check. Not only are the side walls closing in, but there aren't 10 feet of water ahead or astern of the Nautilus. All around us this freeze is gaining fast." "How long," I asked, "will the oxygen in the air tanks enable us to breathe on board?" The captain looked me straight in the eye. "After tomorrow," he said, "the air tanks will be empty." I broke out in a cold sweat, but why should I have been startled by this reply? On March 22nd, the Nautilus had dived under the open waters at the pole. It was now the 26th. We had lived off the ship's stores for 5 days, and all remaining breathable air had to be saved for the workmen. Even today, as I write these lines, my sensations are so intense that an involuntary terror sweeps over me, and my lungs still seem short of air. Meanwhile, motionless and silent, Captain Nemo stood lost in thought. An idea visibly crossed his mind, but he seemed to brush it aside. He told himself, no. At last these words escaped his lips. "Boiling water," he muttered. "Boiling water?" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir. We're shut up in a relatively confined area. If the Nautilus's pumps continually injected streams of boiling water into this space, wouldn't that raise its temperature and delay its freezing?" "It's worth trying," I said resolutely. "So let's try it, Professor." By then the thermometer gave -7° outside. Captain Nemo led me to the galley where a huge distilling mechanism was at work, supplying drinking water via evaporation. The mechanism was loaded with water, and the full electric heat of our batteries was thrown into coils awash in liquid. In a few minutes the water reached 100°C. It was sent to the pumps while new water replaced it in the process. The heat generated by our batteries was so intense that after simply going through the mechanism, water drawn cold from the sea arrived boiling hot at the body of the pump. The steaming water was injected into the icy water outside, and after 3 hours had passed, the thermometer gave the exterior temperature as -6°C. That was 1 degree gained. 2 hours later the thermometer gave only -4°. After I monitored the operation's progress, double-checking it with many inspections, I told the captain, "It's working." "I think so," he answered me. "We've escaped being crushed. Now we have only asphyxiation to fear." During the night the water temperature rose to -1°C. The injections couldn't get it to go a single degree higher, but since salt water freezes only at -2°, I was finally assured that there was no danger of it solidifying. By the next day, March 27, 6 meters of ice had been torn from the socket. Only 4 meters were left to be removed. That still meant 48 hours of work. The air couldn't be renewed in the Nautilus's interior. Accordingly, that day it kept getting worse. An unbearable heaviness weighed me down. Near 3 o'clock in the afternoon this agonizing sensation affected me to an intense degree. Yawns dislocated my jaws. My lungs were gasping in their quest for that enkindling elastic fluid required for breathing, now growing scarcer and scarcer. My mind was in a daze. I lay outstretched, strength gone, nearly unconscious. My gallant Conseil felt the same symptoms, suffered the same sufferings, yet never left my side. He held my hand, he kept encouraging me, and I even heard him mutter, "Oh, if only I didn't have to breathe, to leave more air for master." It brought tears to my eyes to hear him say these words. Since conditions inside were universally unbearable, how eagerly, how happily we put on our diving suits to take turns working! Picks rang out on that bed of ice, arms grew weary, hands were rubbed raw, but who cared about exhaustion? What difference were wounds? Life-sustaining air reached our lungs. We could breathe. We could breathe. And yet nobody prolonged his underwater work beyond the time allotted him. His shift over, each man surrendered to a gasping companion the air tank that would revive him. Captain Nemo set the example and was foremost in submitting to this strict discipline. When his time was up, he yielded his equipment to another and re-entered the foul air on board, always calm, unflinching, and uncomplaining. That day the usual work was accomplished with even greater energy. Over the whole surface area only 2 meters were left to be removed. Only 2 meters separated us from the open sea, but the ship's air tanks were nearly empty. The little air that remained had to be saved for the workmen, not an atom for the Nautilus. When I returned on board, I felt half suffocated. What a night! I'm unable to depict it. Such sufferings are indescribable. The next day I was short-winded, Headaches and staggering fits of dizziness made me reel like a drunk. My companions were experiencing the same symptoms. Some crewmen were at their last gasp. That day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo concluded that Pix and Maddox were too slow to deal with the ice layer still separating us from open water, and he decided to crush this layer. The man had kept his energy and composure. He had subdued physical pain with moral strength. He could still think, plan, and act. At his orders, the craft was eased off. In other words, it was raised from its icy bed by a change in its specific gravity. When it was afloat, the crew towed it, leading it right above the immense trench outlined to match the ship's waterline. Next, the ballast tanks filled with water. The boat sank and was fitted into its socket. Just then the whole crew returned on board, and the double outside door was closed. By this point the Nautilus was resting on a bed of ice only 1 meter thick, and drilled by bores in 1,000 places. The stopcocks of the ballast tanks were then opened wide, and 100 cubic meters of water rushed in, increasing the Nautilus's weight by 100,000 kilograms. We waited, we listened, we forgot our sufferings. We hoped once more we had staked our salvation on this one last gamble. Despite the buzzing in my head, I soon could hear vibrations under the Nautilus's hull. We tilted. The ice cracked with an odd ripping sound like paper tearing, and the Nautilus began settling downward. "We're going through," Conseil muttered in my ear. I couldn't answer him. I clutched his hand. I squeezed it in an involuntary convulsion. All at once, carried away by its frightful excess load, the Nautilus sank into the waters like a cannonball. In other words, dropping as if in a vacuum. Our full electric power was then put on the pumps, which instantly began to expel water from the ballast tanks. After a few minutes we had checked our fall. The pressure gauge soon indicated an ascending movement. Brought to full speed, the propeller made the sheet iron hull tremble down to its rivets, and we sped northward. But how long would it take to navigate under the ice bank to the open sea? Another day? I would be dead first. Half lying on a couch in the library, I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, my faculties in abeyance. I could no longer see or hear. I had lost all sense of time. My muscles had no power to contract. I'm unable to estimate the hours that passed in this way, but I was aware that my death throes had begun. I realized that I was about to die. Suddenly I regained consciousness. A few whiffs of air had entered my lungs. Had we risen to the surface of the waves? Had we cleared the ice bank? No. Ned and Conseil, my two gallant friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. A few atoms of air were still left in the depths of one Rouquayrol device. Instead of breathing it themselves, they had saved it for me, and while they were suffocating, they poured life into me drop by drop. I tried to push the device away. They held my hands, and for a few moments I could breathe luxuriously. My eyes flew toward the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It had to be March 28. The Nautilus was traveling at the frightful speed of 40 miles per hour. It was writhing in the waters. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he perished? Had his companions died with him? Just then the pressure gauge indicated that we were no more than 20 feet from the surface. Separating us from the open air was a mere tract of ice. Could we break through it? Perhaps. In any event, the Nautilus was going to try. In fact, I could feel it assuming an oblique position, lowering its stern and raising its spur. The admission of additional water was enough to shift its balance. Then, driven by its powerful propeller, it attacked this ice field from below like a fearsome battering ram. It split the barrier little by little, backing up, then putting on full speed against the punctured tract of ice, and finally, carried away by its supreme momentum, it lunged through and onto this frozen surface, crushing the ice beneath its weight. The hatches were opened, or torn off if you prefer, and waves of clean air were admitted into every part of the Nautilus. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got onto the platform I'm unable to say. Perhaps the Canadian transferred me there, but I could breathe. I could inhale the life-giving sea air. Next to me, my two companions were getting tipsy on the fresh oxygen particles. Poor souls who have suffered from long starvation mustn't pounce heedlessly on the first food given them. We, on the other hand, didn't have to practice such moderation. We could suck the atoms from the air by the lungful, and it was the breeze itself that poured into us this luxurious intoxication. Ah, Conseil was putting in. What fine oxygen! Let Master have no fears about breathing. There's enough for everyone. As for Ned Land, he didn't say a word, but his wide-open jaws would have scared off a shark. And what powerful inhalations! The Canadian drew like a furnace going full blast. Our strength returned promptly, and when I looked around I saw that we were alone on the platform. No crewmen, not even Captain Nemo. Those strange seamen on the Nautilus were content with the oxygen circulating inside. Not one of them had come up to enjoy the open air. The first words I pronounced were words of appreciation and gratitude to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had kept me alive during the final hours of our long death throes, but no expression of thanks could repay them fully for such devotion. "Good Lord, Professor," Ned Land answered me. "Don't mention it. What did we do that's so praiseworthy? Not a thing. It was a question of simple arithmetic. Your life is worth more than ours, so we had to save it." "No, Ned," I replied, "it isn't worth more. Nobody could be better than a kind and generous man like yourself." All right," the Canadian repeated in embarrassment. "And you, my gallant Conseil, you suffered a great deal." "Not too much, to be candid with Master. I was lacking a few throatfuls of air, but I would have gotten by. Besides, when I saw Master fainting, it left me without the slightest desire to breathe. It took my breath away in a manner of—" Confounded by this lapse into banality, Conseil left his sentence hanging. "My friends," I replied, very moved, "we're bound to each other forever, and I'm deeply indebted to you." "Which I'll take advantage of," the Canadian shot back. "Eh?" Conseil put in. "Yes," Ned Land went on, "you can repay your debt by coming with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus." "By the way," Conseil said, "are we going in a favorable direction?" "Yes," I replied, "because we're going in the direction of the sun, and here the sun is due north." "Sure," Ned Land went on, "but it remains to be seen whether we'll make for the Atlantic or the Pacific. In other words, whether we'll end up in well-traveled or deserted seas." I had no reply to this, and I feared that Captain Nemo wouldn't take us homeward, but rather into that huge ocean washing the shores of both Asia and America. In this way he would complete his underwater tour of the world, going back to those seas where the Nautilus enjoyed the greatest freedom. But if we returned to the Pacific, far from every populated shore, what would happen to Ned Land's plans? We would soon settle this important point. The Nautilus traveled swiftly. Soon we had cleared the Antarctic Circle, plus the promontory of Cape Horn. We were abreast of the tip of South America by March 31 at 7 o'clock in the evening. By then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The memory of that imprisonment under the ice faded from our minds. We had thoughts only of the future. Captain Nemo no longer appeared, neither in the lounge nor on the platform. The positions reported each day on the world map were put there by the chief officer, and they enabled me to determine the Nautilus's exact heading. Now then, that evening it became obvious, much to my satisfaction, that we were returning north by the Atlantic route. I shared the results of my observations with the Canadian and Conseil. "That's good news," the Canadian replied. "But where's the Nautilus going?" "I'm unable to say, Ned." "After the South Pole, does our captain want to tackle the North Pole, then go back to the Pacific by the notorious Northwest Passage?" "I wouldn't double dare him," Conseil replied. "Ah, well," the Canadian said, "we'll give him the slip long before then." "In any event," Conseil added, "he's a superman, that Captain Nemo, and we'll never regret having known him." "Especially once we've left him," Ned Land shot back. The next day, April 1, when the Nautilus rose to the surface of the waves a few minutes before noon, we raised land to the west. It was Tierra del Fuego, the Land of Fire, a name given it by early navigators after they saw numerous curls of smoke rising from the natives' huts. This Land of Fire forms a huge cluster of islands over 30 leagues long and 80 leagues wide, extending between latitudes 53 degrees and 56 degrees south, and between longitude 67 degrees 50 minutes and 77 degrees 15 minutes west. Its coastline looked flat, but high mountains rose in the distance. I even thought I glimpsed Mount Sarmiento, whose elevation is 2,070 meters above sea level, a pyramid-shaped block of shale, with a very sharp summit, which, depending on whether it's clear or veiled in vapor, predicts fair weather or foul, as Ned Land told me. "A first-class barometer, my friend." "Yes, sir, a natural barometer that didn't let me down when I navigated the narrows of the Strait of Magellan." Just then its peak appeared before us, standing out distinctly against the background of the skies. This forecast fair weather, and so it proved. Going back under the waters, the Nautilus drew near the coast, cruising along it for only a few miles. Through the lounge windows I could see long creepers and gigantic fucus plants, bulb-bearing seaweed of which the open sea at the pole had revealed a few specimens. With their smooth, viscous filaments, they measured as much as 300 meters long, genuine cables more than an inch thick and very tough. They are often used as mooring lines for ships. Another weed, known by the name Velp, and boasting 4-foot leaves, was crammed into the coral concretions and carpeted the ocean floor. It served as both nest and nourishment for myriads of crustaceans and mollusks, for crabs and cuttlefish. Here seals and otters could indulge in a sumptuous meal, mixing meat from fish with vegetables from the sea, like the English with their Irish stews. The Nautilus passed over these lush, luxuriant depths with tremendous speed. Near evening it approached the Falkland Islands, whose rugged summits I recognized the next day. The sea was of moderate depth, so, not without good reason, I assumed that these two islands, plus the many islets surrounding them, used to be part of the Magellan coastline. The Falkland Islands were probably discovered by the famous navigator John Davis, who gave them the name Davis Southern Islands. Later, Sir Richard Hawkins called them the Maidenland, after the Blessed Virgin. Subsequently, at the beginning of the 18th century, they were named the Malouines by fishermen from St. Malo in Brittany, then finally dubbed the Falklands by the English, to whom they belong today. In these waterways our nets brought up fine samples of algae, in particular certain fucus plants whose roots were laden with the world's best mussels. Geese and duck alighted by the dozens on the platforms and soon took their places in the ship's pantry. As for fish, I specifically observed some bony fish belonging to the goby genus, especially some gudgeon 2 decimeters long, sprinkled with whitish and yellow spots. I likewise marveled at the numerous medusas, including the most beautiful of their breed, the compass jellyfish, unique to the Falkland Seas. Some of these jellyfish were shaped like very smooth, semi-spheric parasols with russet stripes and fringes of 12 neat festoons. Others looked like upside-down baskets from which wide leaves and long red twigs were gracefully trailing. They swam with quiverings of their 4 leaf-like arms, letting the opulent tresses of their tentacles dangle in the drift. I wanted to preserve a few specimens of these delicate zoophytes, but they were merely clouds, shadows, illusions melting and evaporating outside their native element. When the last tips of the Falkland Islands had disappeared below the horizon, the Nautilus submerged to a depth of between 20 and 25 meters, and went along the South American coast. Captain Nemo didn't put in an appearance. We didn't leave these Patagonian waterways until April 3, sometimes cruising under the ocean, sometimes on its surface. The Nautilus passed the wide estuary formed by the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, and on April 4 we lay abreast of Uruguay, albeit 50 miles out. Keeping to its northerly heading, it followed the long windings of South America. By then we had fared 16,000 leagues since coming on board in the seas of Japan. Near 11 o'clock in the morning we cut the Tropic of Capricorn on the 37th meridian, passing well out from Cape Frio. Much to Ned Land's displeasure, Captain Nemo had no liking for the neighborhood of Brazil's populous shores, because he shot by with dizzying speed. Not even the swiftest fish or birds could keep up with us, and the natural curiosities in these seas completely eluded our observation. This speed was maintained for several days, and on the evening of April 9 we raised South America's easternmost tip, Cape São Roque. But then the Nautilus veered away again and went looking for the lowest depths of an underwater valley gouged between this cape and Sierra Leone on the coast of Africa. Abreast of the West Indies, this valley forks into 2 arms, and to the north it ends in an enormous depression 9,000 meters deep. From this locality to the Lesser Antilles, the ocean's geologic profile features a steeply cut cliff, 6 kilometers high, and abreast of the Cape Verde Islands. There's another wall just as imposing. Together these 2 barricades confine the whole submerged continent of Atlantis. The floor of this immense valley is made picturesque by mountains that furnish these underwater depths with scenic views. This description is based mostly on certain hand-drawn charts kept in the Nautilus's library, charts obviously rendered by Captain Nemo himself, from his own personal observations. For 2 days we visited these deep and deserted waters by means of our slanting fins. The Nautilus would do long diagonal dives that took us to every level, but on April 11 it rose suddenly, and the shore reappeared at the mouth of the Amazon River, a huge estuary whose outflow is so considerable it desalts the sea over an area of several leagues. We cut the equator. 20 miles to the west lay Guiana, French territory, where we could easily have taken refuge. But the wind was blowing a strong gust, and the furious billows would not allow us to face them in a mere skiff. No doubt Ned Land understood this, because he said nothing to me. For my part, I made no allusion to his escape plans, because I didn't want to push him into an attempt that was certain to misfire. I was readily compensated for this delay by fascinating research. During those 2 days of April 11 to 12, the Nautilus didn't leave the surface of the sea, and its trawl brought up a simply miraculous catch of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes were dredged up by the chain of our trawl. Most were lovely sea anemone belonging to the family Actinidia, including among other species the Phyctalis protexta, native to this part of the ocean, a small cylindrical trunk adorned with vertical lines, mottled with red spots and crowned by a wondrous blossoming of tentacles. As for mollusks, they consisted of exhibits I had already observed: turret snails, olive shells of the tent olive species with neatly intersecting lines and russet spots standing out sharply against a flesh-colored background, fanciful spider-conchs that looked like petrified scorpions, transparent glass snails, argonauts, some highly edible cuttlefish, and certain species of squid that the naturalists of antiquity classified with the flying fish, which are used chiefly as bait for catching cod. As for the fish in these waterways, I noted various species that I hadn't yet had the opportunity to study. Among cartilaginous fish, some brook lamprey, a type of eel 15 inches long, head greenish, fins violet, back bluish-gray, belly a silvery brown strewn with bright spots, iris of the eye encircled in gold, unusual animals that the Amazon's current must have swept out to sea because their natural habitat is fresh water. Stingrays, the snout pointed, the tail long, slender, and armed with an extensive jagged sting. Small 1-meter sharks, with gray and whitish hides, their teeth arranged in several backward curving rows. Fish commonly known by the name carpet shark. Batfish, a sort of reddish isosceles triangle, 1/2 meter long, whose pectoral fins are attached by fleshy extensions that make these fish look like bats, although an appendage made of horn, located near the nostrils, earns them the nickname of sea unicorns. Lastly, a couple species of triggerfish, the cucoyo, whose stippled flanks glitter with a sparkling gold color, and the bright purple leather jacket, whose hues glisten like a pigeon's throat. I'll finish up this catalogue, a little dry but quite accurate, with the series of bony fish I observed. Eels belonging to the genus Apteronotus, whose snow-white snout is very blunt, the body painted a handsome black and armed with a very long, slender, fleshy whip. Long sardines from the genus Odontognathus, like 3-decimeter pike, shining with a bright silver glow, Guaranian mackerel furnished with 2 anal fins, black-tinted rudderfish that you catch by using torches, fish measuring 2 meters and boasting white, firm, plump meat that, when fresh, tastes like eel, when dried, like smoked salmon. Semi-red wrasse, sporting scales only at the bases of their dorsal and anal fins. Grunts on which gold and silver mingle their luster with that of ruby and topaz. Yellow-tailed gilthead, whose flesh is extremely dainty, and whose phosphorescent properties give them away in the midst of the waters. Porgies tinted orange, with slender tongues, croakers with gold caudal fins, black surgeonfish, 4-eyed fish from Suriname, etc. This etc. won't keep me from mentioning one more fish that Conseil, with good reason, will long remember. One of our nets had hauled up a type of very flat ray that weighed some 20 kilograms. With its tail cut off, it would have formed a perfect disk. It was white underneath and reddish on top, with big round spots of deep blue encircled in black, its hide quite smooth and ending in a double-lobed fin. Laid out on the platform, it kept struggling with convulsive movements, trying to turn over, making such efforts that its final lunge was about to flip it into the sea, but Conseil, being very possessive of his fish, rushed at it, and before I could stop him, he seized it with both hands. Instantly there he was, thrown on his back, legs in the air, his body half paralyzed, and yelling. "Oh, sir, sir, will you help me?" For once in his life the poor lad didn't address me in the third person. The Canadian and I sat him up. We massaged his contracted arms, and when he regained his 5 senses, that eternal classifier mumbled in a broken voice, "A glass of cartilaginous fish. Order Chondropterygia with fixed gills. Suborder Salacia. Family Regiforma. Genus Electric Ray." "Yes, my friend," I answered, "it was an electric ray that put you in this deplorable state." "Oh, master can trust me on this," Conseil shot back. "I'll be revenged on that animal." "How?" "I'll eat it." which he did that same evening, but strictly as retaliation, because, frankly, it tasted like leather. Poor Conseil had assaulted an electric ray of the most dangerous species, the cumana. Living in a conducting medium such as water, this bizarre animal can electrocute other fish from several meters away. So great is the power of its electric organ, an organ whose two chief surfaces measure at least 27 square feet. During the course of the next day, April 12, the Nautilus drew near the coast of Dutch Guiana, by the mouth of the Maroni River. There several groups of sea cows were living in family units. These were manatees, which belonged to the order Sirenia. Like the dugong and Steller's sea cow, harmless and unaggressive, these fine animals were 6 to 7 meters long, and must have weighed at least 4,000 kilograms each. I told Ned Land and Conseil that far-seeing nature had given these mammals a major role to play. In essence, manatees, like seals, are designed to graze the underwater prairies, destroying the clusters of weeds that obstruct the mouths of tropical rivers. "And do you know," I added, "what happened since man has almost completely wiped out these beneficial races? Rotting weeds have poisoned the air, and this poisoned air causes the yellow fever that devastates these wonderful countries. This toxic vegetation has increased beneath the seas of the torrid zone, so the disease spreads unchecked from the mouth of the Rio de la Plata to Florida. And if Professor Toussaint is correct, this plague is nothing compared to the scourge that will strike our descendants once the seas are depopulated of whales and seals. By then, crowded with jellyfish, squid, and other devilfish, the oceans will have become huge centers of infection, because their waves will no longer possess these huge stomachs that God has entrusted with scouring the surface of the sea." Meanwhile, without scorning these theories, the Nautilus's crew captured 6 manatees. In essence, it was an issue of stocking the larder with excellent red meat, even better than beef or veal. Their hunting was not a fascinating sport. The manatees let themselves be struck down without offering any resistance. Several thousand kilos of meat were hauled below to be dried and stored. The same day an odd fishing practice further increased the Nautilus's stores, so full of game were these seas. Our trawl brought up in its meshes a number of fish whose heads were topped by little oval slabs with fleshy edges. These were suckerfish, from the third family of the Sabrachian Malacopterygii. These flat discs on their heads consist of crosswise plates of movable cartilage, between which the animals can create a vacuum, enabling them to stick to objects like suction cups. The remoras I had observed in the Mediterranean were related to this species, but the creature at issue here was an Echineusis osteochara, unique to this sea. Right after catching them, our seamen dropped them in buckets of water. Its fishing finished, the Nautilus drew nearer to the coast. In this locality a number of sea turtles were sleeping on the surface of the waves. It would have been difficult to capture these valuable reptiles because they wake up at the slightest sound, and their solid carapaces are harpoon-proof. But our suckerfish would effect their capture with extraordinary certainty and precision. In truth, this animal is a living fishhook, promising wealth and happiness to the greenest fishermen in the business. The Nautilus's men attached to each fish's tail a ring that was big enough not to hamper its movements, and to this ring a long rope whose other end was moored on board. Thrown into the sea, the suckerfish immediately began to play their roles, going and fastening themselves onto the breastplates of the turtles. Their tenacity was so great they would rip apart rather than let go. They were hauled in, still sticking to the turtles that came aboard with them. In this way we caught several loggerheads, reptiles a meter wide and weighing 200 kilos. They're extremely valuable because of their carapaces, which are covered with big slabs of horn, thin, brown, transparent, with white and yellow markings. Besides, they were excellent from an edible viewpoint, with an exquisite flavor comparable to the green turtle. This fishing ended our stay in the waterways of the Amazon, and that evening the Nautilus took to the high seas once more. End of Chapter 17.
Chapter 18. The Devilfish. For some days the Nautilus kept veering away from the American coast. It obviously didn't want to frequent the waves of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. Yet there was no shortage of water under its keel, since the average depth of these seas is 1,800 meters. But these waterways, strewn with islands and ploughed by steamers, probably didn't agree with Captain Nemo. On April 16 we raised Martinique and Guadeloupe from a distance of about 30 miles. For one instant I could see their lofty peaks. The Canadian was quite disheartened, having counted on putting his plans into execution in the Gulf, either by reaching shore or by pulling alongside one of the many boats plying a coastal trade from one island to another. An escape attempt would have been quite feasible, assuming Ned Land managed to seize the skiff without the captain's knowledge, but in mid-ocean it was unthinkable. The Canadian, Conseil, and I had a pretty long conversation on this subject. For 6 months we had been prisoners aboard the Nautilus. We had fared 17,000 leagues, and as Ned Land put it, there was no end in sight. So he made me a proposition I hadn't anticipated. We were to ask Captain Nemo this question straight out. Did the captain mean to keep us on board his vessel permanently? This measure was distasteful to me. To my mind it would lead nowhere. We could hope for nothing from the Nautilus's commander, but could depend only on ourselves. Besides, for some time now the man had been gloomier, more withdrawn, less sociable. He seemed to be avoiding me. I encountered him only at rare intervals. He used to take pleasure in explaining the underwater wonders to me. Now he left me to research and no longer entered the lounge. What changes had come over him? From what cause? I had no reason to blame myself. Was our presence on board perhaps a burden to him? Even so, I cherished no hopes that the man would set us free. So I begged Ned to let me think about it before taking action. If this measure proved fruitless, it could arouse the captain's suspicions, make our circumstances even more arduous, and jeopardize the Canadian's plans. I might add that I could hardly use our state of health as an argument. Except for that drooling ordeal under the ice bank at the South Pole, we had never felt better, neither Ned, Conseil, nor I. The nutritious food, life-giving air, regular routine, and uniform temperature kept illness at bay, and for a man who didn't miss his past existence on land, for Captain Nemo, who was at home here, who went where he wished, who took paths mysterious to others if not himself in attaining his ends, I could understand such a life. But we ourselves hadn't severed all ties with humanity. For my part, I didn't want my new and unusual research to be buried with my bones. I had now earned the right to pen a definitive book on the sea, and sooner or later I wanted that book to see the light of day. There once more, through the panels opening into these Caribbean waters, 10 meters below the surface of the waves, I found so many fascinating exhibits to describe in my daily notes. Among other zoophytes, there were Portuguese men of war, known by the name Phasalia pelagica, like big oblong bladders, with a pearly sheen, spreading their membranes to the wind, letting their blue tentacles drift like silken threads. To the eye, delightful jellyfish; to the touch, actual nettles that ooze a corrosive liquid. Among the articulates, there were annelid worms, 1.5 meters long, furnished with a pink proboscis, equipped with 1,700 organs of locomotion, snaking through the waters, and as they went, throwing off every gleam in the solar spectrum. From the fish branch there were manta rays, enormous cartilaginous fish 10 feet long and weighing 600 pounds. Their pectoral fin triangular, their mid-back slightly arched, their eyes attached to the edges of the face at the front of the head. They floated like wreckage from a ship, sometimes fastening onto our windows like opaque shutters. There were American triggerfish, for which nature has ground only black and white pigments, feather-shaped gobies that were long and plump, with yellow fins and jutting jaws, 16 decimeter mackerel with short, sharp teeth covered with small scale and related to the albacore species. Next came swarms of red mullet, corseted in gold stripes from head to tail, their shining fins all a-quiver, genuine masterpieces of jewellery, formerly sacred to the goddess Diana, much in demand by rich Romans, and about which the old saying goes, "He who catches them doesn't eat them." Finally, adorned with emerald ribbons and dressed in velvet and silk, golden angelfish passed before our eyes like courtiers in the paintings of Veronese. Spurred gilt-heads stole by with their swift thoracic fins. Thread herring 15 inches long were wrapped in their phosphorescent glimmers. Grey mullet thrashed the sea with their big fleshy tails. Red salmon seemed to mow the waves with their slicing pectorals, and silver moonfish, worthy of their name, rose on the horizon of the waters like the whitish reflection of many moons. How many other marvellous new specimens I still could have observed if, little by little, the Nautilus hadn't settled to the lower strata. Its slanting fins drew it to depths of 2,000 and 3,500 meters. There, animal life was represented by nothing more than sea lilies, starfish, delightful crinoids with bell-shaped heads like little chalices on straight stems, top-shell snails, blood-red tooth shells, and fissurella snails, a large species of coastal mollusk. By April 20, we had risen to an average level of 1,500 meters. The nearest land was the island group of the Bahamas, scattered like a batch of cobblestones over the surface of the water. There, high underwater cliffs reared up, straight walls made of craggy chunks arranged like big stone foundations, among which there gaped black caves so deep our electric rays couldn't light them to the far ends. These rocks were hung with huge weeds, immense sea tangle, gigantic fucus, a genuine trellis of water plants fit for a world of giants. In discussing these colossal plants, Conseil, Ned and I were naturally led into mentioning the sea's gigantic animals. The former were obviously meant to feed the latter. However, through the windows of our almost motionless Nautilus, I could see nothing among these long filaments other than the chief articulates of the division Brachyura, long-legged spider crabs, violet crabs, and sponge crabs, unique to the waters of the Caribbean. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a fearsome commotion out in this huge seaweed. "Well," I said, "these are real devilfish caverns, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those monsters hereabouts." "What?" Conseil put in. "Squid? Ordinary squid? From the class Cephalopoda?" "No," I said, "devilfish of large dimensions. But friend Land is no doubt mistaken, because I don't see a thing." "That's regrettable," Conseil answered. "I'd like to come face to face with one of those devilfish I've heard so much about, which can drag ships down into the depths. Those beasts go by the name of crake." "Fake, more like it," the Canadian replied sarcastically. "Krakens," Conseil shot back, finishing his word without wincing at his companion's witticism. "Nobody will ever make me believe," Ned Land said, "that such animals exist." "Why not?" Conseil replied. "We sincerely believed in Master's narwhale." We were wrong, Conseil. No doubt, but there are others with no doubts who believe to this day. Probably, Conseil, but as for me, I'm bound and determined not to accept the existence of any such monster till I've dissected it with my own 2 hands. Yet, Conseil asked me, doesn't Master believe in gigantic devilfish? Yikes! Who in Hades ever believed in them? The Canadian exclaimed. Many people, Ned, my friend, I said. No fishermen, scientists, maybe. Pardon me, Ned, fishermen and scientists. Why, I to whom you speak, Conseil said, with the world's straightest face. I recall perfectly seeing a large boat dragged under the waves by the arms of a cephalopod. You saw that? The Canadian asked. Yes, Ned. With your own 2 eyes? With my own 2 eyes. Where, may I ask? In St. Malo, Conseil returned unflappably. In the harbour? Ned Land said sarcastically. No, in a church, Conseil replied. In a church? The Canadian exclaimed. Yes, Ned, my friend. It had a picture that portrayed the devilfish in question. Oh, good, Ned Land exclaimed with a burst of laughter. Mr. Conseil put one over on me. Actually, he's right, I said. I've heard about that picture, but the subject it portrays is taken from a legend, and you know how to rate legends in matters of natural history. Besides, when it's an issue of monsters, the human imagination always tends to run wild. People not only claimed these devilfish could drag ships under, but a certain Olaus Magnus tells of a cephalopod a mile long that looked more like an island than an animal. There's also the story of how the Bishop of Trondheim set up an altar one day on an immense rock. After he finished saying Mass, this rock started moving and went back into the sea. The rock was a devilfish. And that's everything we know? The Canadian asked. No, I replied. Another bishop, Pontoppidan of Bergen, also tells of a devilfish, so large a whole cavalry regiment could manoeuvre on it. They sure did go on, those old-time bishops, Ned Land said. Finally, the naturalists of antiquity mentioned some monsters with mouths as big as a gulf, which were too huge to get through the Straits of Gibraltar. Good work, men, the Canadian put in. But in all these stories, is there any truth? Conseil asked. None at all, my friends, at least in those that go beyond the bounds of credibility and fly off into fable or legend. Yet, for the imaginings of these storytellers, there had to be, if not a cause, at least an excuse. It can't be denied that some species of squid and other devilfish are quite large, though still smaller than cetaceans. Aristotle put the dimensions of one squid at 5 cubits, or 3.1 meters. Our fishermen frequently see specimens over 1.8 meters long. The museums in Trieste and Montpellier have preserved some devilfish carcasses measuring 2 meters. Besides, according to the calculations of naturalists, one of these animals, only 6 feet long, would have tentacles as long as 27, which is enough to make a fearsome monster. Does anybody fish for them nowadays? The Canadian asked. If they don't fish for them, sailors at least sight them. A friend of mine, Captain Paul Boss of Le Havre, has often sworn to me that he encountered one of these monsters of colossal size in the seas of the East Indies. But the most astonishing event, which proves that these gigantic animals undeniably exist, took place a few years ago in 1861. What event was that? Ned Land asked. Just this. In 1861, to the northeast of Tenerife, and fairly near the latitude where we are right now, the crew of the gunboat Alecto spotted a monstrous squid swimming in their waters. Commander Bouger approached the animal and attacked it with blows from harpoons and blasts from rifles, but without much success, because bullets and harpoons crossed its soft flesh as if it were semi-liquid jelly. After several fruitless attempts, the crew managed to slip a noose around the mollusk's body. The noose slid as far as the caudal fins and came to a halt. Then they tried to haul the monster on board, but its weight was so considerable that when they tugged on the rope, the animal parted company with its tail, and deprived of this adornment, it disappeared beneath the waters. "Finally, an actual event," Ned Land said. "An indisputable event, my gallant Ned. Accordingly, people have proposed naming this devil's fish Bouger's squid." "And how long was it?" the Canadian asked. "Didn't it measure about 6 meters?" said Consul, who was stationed at the window and examining anew the crevices in the cliff. "Precisely," I replied. "Wasn't its head," Consul went on, "crowned by 8 tentacles that quivered in the water like a nest of snakes?" "Precisely." "Weren't its eyes prominently placed and considerably enlarged?" "Yes, Consul." "And wasn't its mouth a real parrot's beak, but of fearsome size?" "Correct, Consul." "Well, with all due respect to master," Consul replied serenely, "if this isn't Bouger's squid, it's at least one of his close relatives." I stared at Consul. Ned Land rushed to the window. "What an awful animal!" he exclaimed. I stared in my turn, and couldn't keep back a movement of revulsion. Before my eyes there quivered a horrible monster worthy of a place amongst the most far-fetched teratological legends. It was a squid of colossal dimensions, fully 8 meters long. It was travelling backward with tremendous speed in the same direction as the Nautilus. It gazed with enormous staring eyes that were tinted sea green. Its 8 arms, or more accurately feet, were rooted in its head, which has earned these animals the name cephalopod. Its arms stretched a distance twice the length of its body, and were writhing like the serpentine hair of the Furies. You could plainly see its 250 suckers arranged over the inner sides of its tentacles and shaped like semi-ferric capsules. Sometimes these suckers fastened onto the lounge window by creating vacuums against it. The monster's mouth, a beak made of horn and shaped like that of a parrot, opened and closed vertically. Its tongue, also of horn substance and armed with several rows of sharp teeth, would flicker out from between these genuine shears. What a freak of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk. Its body was spindle-shaped and swollen in the middle, a fleshy mass that must have weighed 20,000 to 25,000 kilograms. Its unstable colour would change with tremendous speed as the animal grew irritated, passing successively from bluish grey to reddish brown. What was irritating this mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, even more fearsome than itself, and which it couldn't grip with its mandibles or the suckers on its arms. And yet what monsters these devilfish are! What vitality our Creator has given them! What vigour in their movements, thanks to their owning a triple heart! Sheer chance had placed us in the presence of this squid, and I didn't want to lose this opportunity to meticulously study such a cephalopod specimen. I overcame the horror that its appearance inspired in me, picked up a pencil and began to sketch it. "Perhaps this is the same as the Alectos," Conseil said. "Can't be," the Canadian replied, "because this one's complete, while the other lost its tail." "That doesn't necessarily follow," I said. "The arms and tails of these animals grow back through regeneration, and in 7 years the tail on Bouger's squid has surely had time to sprout again." "Anyhow," Ned shot back, "if it isn't this fellow, maybe it's one of those." Indeed, other devilfish had appeared at our starboard window. I counted 7 of them. They provided the Nautilus with an escort, and I could hear their beaks gnashing on the sheet iron hull. We couldn't have asked for a more devoted following. I continued sketching. These monsters kept pace in our waters with such precision, they seemed to be standing still, and I could have traced their outlines in miniature on the window, but we were moving at a moderate speed. All at once the Nautilus stopped. A jolt made it tremble through its entire framework. "Did we strike bottom?" I asked. "In any event, we're already clear," the Canadian replied, "because we're afloat." The Nautilus was certainly afloat, but it was no longer in motion. The blades of its propeller weren't churning the waters. A minute passed. Followed by his chief officer, Captain Nemo entered the lounge. I hadn't seen him for a good while. He looked gloomy to me. Without speaking to us, without even seeing us perhaps, he went to the panel, stared at the devilfish, and said a few words to his chief officer. The latter went out. Soon the panels closed, the ceiling lit up. I went over to the captain. "An unusual assortment of devilfish," I told him, as carefree as a collector in front of an aquarium. "Correct, Mr. Naturalist," he answered me, "and we're going to fight them at close quarters." I gaped at the captain. I thought my hearing had gone bad. "At close quarters?" I repeated. "Yes, sir. Our propeller is jammed. I think the horn-covered mandibles of one of these squid are entangled in the blades. That's why we aren't moving." "And what are you going to do?" "Rise to the surface and slaughter the vermin." "A difficult undertaking." "Correct. Our electric bullets are ineffective against such soft flesh, where they don't meet enough resistance to go off. But we'll attack the beast with axes." "And harpoons, sir," the Canadian said, "if you don't turn down my help." "I accept it, Mr. Land." "We'll go with you," I said, and we followed Captain Nemo heading to the central companionway. There, some 10 men were standing by for the assault, armed with boarding axes. Conseil and I picked up 2 more axes. Ned Land seized the harpoon. By then, the Nautilus had returned to the surface of the waves. Stationed on the top steps, one of the seamen undid the bolts of the hatch. But he had scarcely unscrewed the nut when the hatch flew up with tremendous violence, obviously pulled open by the suckers on a devilfish's arm. Instantly, one of those long arms glided like a snake into the opening, and 20 others were quivering above. With a sweep of the axe, Captain Nemo chopped off this fearsome tentacle, which slid writhing down the steps. Just as we were crowding each other to reach the platform, 2 more arms lashed the air, swooped on the seaman stationed in front of him, Captain Nemo, and carried the fellow away with irresistible violence. Captain Nemo gave a shout and leaped outside. We rushed after him. What a scene! Seized by the tentacle and glued to its suckers, the unfortunate man was swinging in the air at the mercy of this enormous appendage. He gasped, he choked, he yelled, "Help! Help!" These words, pronounced in French, left me deeply stunned. So, I had a fellow countryman on board, perhaps several. I'll hear this harrowing plea for the rest of my life. The poor fellow was done for. Who could tear him from such a powerful grip? Even so, Captain Nemo rushed at the devilfish, and with a sweep of the axe, hewed one more of its arms. His chief officer struggled furiously with the other monsters crawling up the Nautilus's sides. The crew battled with flailing axes. The Canadian, Conseil and I sank our weapons into these fleshy masses. An intense, musky odour filled the air. It was horrible. For an instant, I thought the poor man entwined by the devilfish might be torn loose from its powerful suction. 7 arms out of 8 had been chopped off. Brandishing its victim like a feather, one lone tentacle was writhing in the air. But just as Captain Nemo and his chief officer rushed at it, the animal shot off a spout of blackish liquid, secreted by a pouch located in its abdomen. It blinded us. When this cloud had dispersed, the squid was gone, and so was my poor fellow countryman. What rage then drove us against these monsters! We lost all self-control. 10 or 12 devilfish had overrun the Nautilus's platform and sides. We piled helter-skelter into the thick of those sawed-off snakes, which darted over the platform amid waves of blood and sepia ink. It seemed as if these vicious tentacles grew back like the many heads of Hydra. At every thrust, Ned Land's harpoon would plunge into a squid's sea-green eye and burst it. But my daring companion was suddenly toppled by the tentacles of a monster he could not avoid. Oh, my heart nearly exploded with excitement and horror. The squid's fearsome beak was wide open over Ned Land. The poor man was about to be cut in half. I ran to his rescue, but Captain Nemo got there first. His axe disappeared between the two enormous mandibles, and the Canadian, miraculously saved, stood and plunged his harpoon all the way into the devilfish's triple heart. Tit for tat, Captain Nemo told the Canadian. I owed it to myself. Ned bowed without answering him. This struggle had lasted a quarter of an hour. Defeated, mutilated, battered to death, the monsters finally yielded to us and disappeared beneath the waves. Red with blood, motionless by the beacon, Captain Nemo stared at the sea that had swallowed one of his companions, and large tears streamed from his eyes. End of Chapter 18.
Chapter 19. The Gulf Stream. This dreadful scene on April 20 none of us will ever be able to forget. I wrote it up in a state of intense excitement. Later I reviewed my narrative. I read it to Conseil and the Canadian. They found it accurate in detail but deficient in impact. To convey such sights, it would take the pen of our most famous poet, Victor Hugo, author of The Toilers of the Sea. As I said, Captain Nemo wept while staring at the waves. His grief was immense. This was the second companion he had lost since we had come aboard. And what a way to die! Smashed, strangled, crushed by the fearsome arms of a devilfish, ground between its iron mandibles. This friend would never rest with his companions in the placid waters of their coral cemetery. As for me, what had harrowed my heart in the thick of this struggle was the despairing yell given by this unfortunate man. Forgetting his regulation language, this poor Frenchman had reverted to speaking his own mother tongue, to fling out one supreme plea. Among the Nautilus's crew, allied body and soul with Captain Nemo, and likewise fleeing from human contact, I had found a fellow countryman. Was he the only representative of France in this mysterious alliance, obviously made up of individuals from different nationalities? This was just one more of those insoluble problems that kept welling up in my mind. Captain Nemo re-entered his stateroom, and I saw no more of him for a good while. But how sad, despairing, and irresolute he must have felt, to judge from this ship whose soul he was, which reflected his every mood. The Nautilus no longer kept to a fixed heading. It drifted back and forth, riding with the waves like a corpse. Its propeller had been disentangled, but was barely put to use. It was navigating at random. It couldn't tear itself away from the setting of this last struggle, from this sea that had devoured one of its own. 10 days went by in this way. It was only on May 1 that the Nautilus openly resumed its northbound course, after raising the Bahamas at the mouth of Old Bahama Channel. We then went with the current of the sea's greatest river, which has its own banks, fish, and temperature. I mean the Gulf Stream. It is indeed a river that runs independently through the middle of the Atlantic, its waters never mixing with the ocean's waters. It's a salty river, saltier than the sea surrounding it. Its average depth is 3,000 feet, its average width 60 miles. In certain localities its current moves at a speed of 4 kilometers per hour. The unchanging volume of its waters is greater than that of all the world's rivers combined. As discovered by Commander Maury, the true source of the Gulf Stream, its starting point, if you prefer, is located in the Bay of Biscay. There its waters, still weak in temperature and color, begin to form. It goes down south, skirts equatorial Africa, warms its waves in the rays of the torrid zone, crosses the Atlantic, reaches Cape Sao Roque on the coast of Brazil, and forks into 2 branches, one going to the Caribbean Sea for further saturation with heat particles, then entrusted with restoring the balance between hot and cold temperatures, and with mixing tropical and northern waters, the Gulf Stream begins to play its stabilizing role. Attaining a white heat in the Gulf of Mexico, it heads north up the American coast, advances as far as Newfoundland, swerves away under the thrust of a cold current from the Davis Strait, and resumes its ocean course by going along a great circle of the earth on a rhumb line. It then divides into two arms near the 43rd parallel. One, helped by the northeast trade winds, returns to the Bay of Biscay and the Azores. The other washes the shores of Ireland and Norway with lukewarm water, goes beyond Spitzbergen where its temperature falls to 4 degrees centigrade, and fashions the open sea at the pole. It was on this oceanic river that the Nautilus was then navigating, leaving Old Bahama Channel, which is 14 leagues wide by 350 meters deep. The Gulf Stream moves at the rate of 8 kilometers per hour. Its speed steadily decreases as it advances northward, and we must pray that this steadiness continues because, as experts agree, if its speed and direction were to change, the climates of Europe would undergo disturbances whose consequences are incalculable. Near noon I was on the platform with Conseil. I shared with him the relevant details on the Gulf Stream. When my explanation was over, I invited him to dip his hands into its current. Conseil did so, and he was quite astonished to experience no sensation of either hot or cold. "That comes," I told him, "from the water temperature of the Gulf Stream, which, as it leaves the Gulf of Mexico, is barely different from your blood temperature. This Gulf Stream is a huge heat generator that enables the coasts of Europe to be decked in eternal greenery, and if Commander Maury is correct, were one to harness the full warmth of this current, it would supply enough heat to keep molten a river of iron solder as big as the Amazon or the Missouri." Just then the Gulf Stream's speed was 2.25 meters per second. So distinct is its current from the surrounding sea, its confined waters stand out against the ocean, and operate on a different level from the colder waters. Murky as well, and very rich in saline material, their pure indigo contrasts with the green waves surrounding them. Moreover, their line of demarcation is so clear that abreast of the Carolinas, the Nautilus's spur cut the waves of the Gulf Stream while its propeller was still churning those belonging to the ocean. This current swept along with it a whole host of moving creatures. Argonauts, so common in the Mediterranean, voyaged here in schools of large numbers. Among cartilaginous fish, the most remarkable were rays whose ultra-slender tails made up nearly a third of the body, which was shaped like a huge diamond, 25 feet long. Then little 1-meter sharks, the head large, the snout short and rounded, the teeth sharp and arranged in several rows, the body seemingly covered with scales. Among bony fish I noted grizzled wrasse unique to these seas, deep-water gilthead whose iris has a fiery gleam, 1-meter croakers whose large mouths bristle with small teeth and which let out thin cries, black rudderfish like those I've already discussed, blue dorados accented with gold and silver, rainbow-hued parrotfish that can rival the loveliest tropical birds in coloring, banded blennies with triangular heads, bluish flounder without scales, toadfish covered with a crosswise yellow band in the shape of a Greek T, swarms of little freckled gobies stippled with brown spots, lungfish with silver heads and yellow tails, various specimens of salmon, mullet, with slim figures, and a softly glowing radiance that Lesipede dedicated to the memory of his wife, and finally the American cavala, a handsome fish decorated by every honorary order, bedizened with their every ribbon, frequenting the shores of this great nation where ribbons and orders are held in such low esteem. I might add that during the night the Gulf Stream's phosphorescent waters rivaled the electric glow of our beacon, especially in the stormy weather that frequently threatened us. On May 8, while abreast of North Carolina, we were across from Cape Hatteras once more. There the Gulf Stream is 75 miles wide and 210 meters deep. The Nautilus continued to wander at random. Seemingly all supervision had been jettisoned. Under these conditions I admit that we could easily have gotten away. In fact, the populous shores offered ready refuge everywhere. The sea was plowed continuously by the many steamers providing service between the Gulf of Mexico and New York or Boston, and it was crossed night and day by little schooners engaged in coastal trade over various points on the American shore. We could hope to be picked up, so it was a promising opportunity, despite the 30 miles that separated the Nautilus from these Union coasts. But one distressing circumstance totally thwarted the Canadians' plans. The weather was thoroughly foul. We were approaching waterways where storms are commonplace, the very homeland of tornadoes and cyclones, specifically engendered by the Gulf Stream's current. To face a frequently raging sea in a frail skiff was a race to certain disaster. Ned Land conceded this himself, so he champed at the bit, in the grip of an intense homesickness that could be cured only by our escape. "Sir," he told me that day, "it's got to stop. I want to get to the bottom of this. Your Nemo's veering away from shore and heading up north. But believe you me, I had my fill at the South Pole, and I'm not going with him to the North Pole." "Oh, what can we do, Ned, since it isn't feasible to escape right now?" "I keep coming back to my idea. We've got to talk to the captain. When we were in your own country seas you didn't say a word. Now that we're in mine I intend to speak up. Before a few days are out I figure the Nautilus will lie abreast of Nova Scotia, and from there to Newfoundland is the mouth of a large gulf, and the St. Lawrence empties into that gulf, and the St. Lawrence is my own river, the river running by Quebec, my hometown. And when I think about all this, my gorge rises and my hair stands on end. Honestly, sir, I'd rather jump overboard. I can't stay here any longer. I'm suffocating." The Canadian was obviously at the end of his patience. His vigorous nature couldn't adapt to this protracted imprisonment. His facial appearance was changing by the day. His moods grew gloomier and gloomier. I had a sense of what he was suffering, because I also was gripped by homesickness. Nearly 7 months had gone by without our having any news from shore. Moreover, Captain Nemo's reclusiveness, his changed disposition, and especially his total silence since the battle with the devilfish, all made me see things in a different light. I no longer felt the enthusiasm of our first days on board. You needed to be Flemish like Conseil to accept these circumstances, living in a habitat designed for cetaceans and other denizens of the deep. Truly, if that gallant lad had owned gills instead of lungs, I think he would have made an outstanding fish. "Well, sir," Ned Land went on, seeing that I hadn't replied. "Well, Ned, you want me to ask Captain Nemo what he intends to do with us?" "Yes, sir." "Even though he has already made that clear?" "Yes. I want it settled once and for all. Speak just for me, strictly on my behalf, if you want." "But I rarely encounter him. He positively avoids me." "All the more reason you should go look him up." "I'll confer with him, Ned." "When?" the Canadian asked insistently. "When I encounter him." "Professor Aronnax, would you like me to go find him myself?" "No, let me do it. Tomorrow." "Today," Ned Land said. "So be it. I'll see him today," I answered the Canadian, who, if he took action himself, would certainly have ruined everything. I was left to myself. His request granted, I decided to dispose of it immediately. I like things over and done with. I re-entered my stateroom. From there I could hear movements inside Captain Nemo's quarters. I couldn't pass up this chance for an encounter. I knocked on his door. I received no reply. I knocked again, then tried the knob. The door opened. I entered. The captain was there. He was bending over his work-table and hadn't heard me. Determined not to leave without questioning him, I drew closer. He looked up sharply with a frowning brow, and said in a pretty stern tone, "Oh, it's you. What do you want?" "To speak with you, Captain." "But I'm busy, sir. I'm at work. I give you the freedom to enjoy your privacy. Can't I have the same for myself?" This reception was less than encouraging, but I was determined to give as good as I got. "Sir," I said coolly, "I need to speak with you on a matter that simply can't wait." "Whatever could that be, sir?" he replied sarcastically. "Have you made some discovery that has escaped me? Has the sea yielded up some novel secret to you?" We were miles apart, but before I could reply he showed me a manuscript open on the table, and told me in a more serious tone, "Here, Professor Aronnax, is a manuscript written in several languages. It contains a summary of my research under the sea, and God willing, it won't perish with me. Signed with my name, complete with my life story, this manuscript will be enclosed in a small, unsinkable contrivance. The last surviving man on the Nautilus will throw this contrivance into the sea, and it will go wherever the waves carry it. The man's name, his life story, written by himself. So the secret of his existence might some day be unveiled?" But just then I saw this announcement only as a lead-in to my topic. "Captain," I replied, "I'm all praise for this idea you're putting into effect. The fruits of your research must not be lost. But the methods you're using strike me as primitive. Who knows where the winds will take that contrivance, into whose hands it may fall? Can't you find something better? Can't you or one of your men—" "Never, sir," the captain said, swiftly interrupting me. "But my companions and I would be willing to safeguard this manuscript, and if you give us back our freedom—" "Your freedom!" Captain Nemo put in, standing up. "Yes, sir, and that's the subject on which I wanted to confer with you. For 7 months we've been aboard your vessel, and I ask you today, in the name of my companions as well as myself, if you intend to keep us here forever." "Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo said, "I'll answer you today just as I did 7 months ago. Whoever boards the Nautilus must never leave it." "What you're inflicting on us is outright slavery." "Call it anything you like." "But every slave has the right to recover his freedom by any worthwhile available means." "Who has denied you that right?" Captain Nemo replied. "Did I ever try to bind you with your word of honor?" The captain stared at me, crossing his arms. "Sir," I told him, "to take up this subject a second time would be distasteful to both of us, so let's finish what we've started. I repeat, it isn't just for myself that I raise this issue. To me, research is a relief, a potent diversion, an enticement, a passion that can make me forget everything else. Like you, I'm a man neglected and unknown, living in the faint hope that some day I can pass on to future generations the fruits of my labors, figuratively speaking, by means of some contrivance left to the luck of winds and waves. In short, I can admire you and comfortably go with you while playing a role I only partly understand, but I still catch glimpses of other aspects of your life that are surrounded by involvements and secrets that, alone on board, my companions and I can't share. And even when our hearts could beat with yours, moved by some of your griefs, or stirred by your deeds of courage and genius, we've had to stifle even the slightest token of that sympathy that arises at the sight of something fine and good, whether it comes from friend or enemy. All right, then. It's this feeling of being alien to your deepest concerns that makes our situation unacceptable, impossible, even impossible for me, but especially for Ned Land. Every man, by virtue of his very humanity, deserves fair treatment. Have you considered how a love of freedom and hatred of slavery could lead to plans of vengeance in a temperament like the Canadian's? What he might think, attempt, endeavor—" I fell silent. Captain Nemo stood up. "Ned Land can think, attempt, or endeavor anything he wants. What difference is it to me? I didn't go looking for him. I don't keep 'em on board for my pleasure. As for you, Professor Aronnax, you're a man able to understand anything, even silence. I have nothing more to say to you. Let this first time you've come to discuss the subject also be the last, because the second time I won't even listen." I withdrew. From that day forward our position was very strained. I reported this conversation to my two companions. "Now we know," Ned said, "that we can't expect a thing from this man. The Nautilus is nearing Long Island. We'll escape, no matter what the weather." But the skies became more and more threatening. There were conspicuous signs of a hurricane on the way. The atmosphere was turning white and milky. Slender sheaves of cirrus clouds were followed on the horizon by layers of nimbocumulus. Other low clouds fled swiftly. The sea grew towering, inflated by long swells. Every bird had disappeared except a few petrels, friends of the storms. The barometer fell significantly, indicating a tremendous tension in the surrounding haze. The mixture in our storm glass decomposed under the influence of the electricity charging the air. A struggle of the elements was approaching. The storm burst during the daytime of May 13, just as the Nautilus was cruising abreast of Long Island, a few miles from the Narrows to Upper New York Bay. I'm able to describe this struggle of the elements because Captain Nemo didn't flee into the ocean depths. Instead, from some inexplicable whim, he decided to brave it out on the surface. The wind was blowing from the southwest, initially a stiff breeze, in other words with a speed of 15 meters per second, which built to 25 meters near 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is the figure for major storms. Unshaken by these squalls, Captain Nemo stationed himself on the platform. He was lashed around the waist to withstand the monstrous breakers foaming over the deck. I hoisted and attached myself to the same place, dividing my wonderment between the storm and this incomparable man who faced it head-on. The raging sea was swept with huge tattered clouds, drenched by the waves. I saw no more of the small intervening billows that form in the troughs of the big crests, just long soot-colored undulations with crests so compact they didn't foam. They kept growing taller. They were spurring each other on, the Nautilus, sometimes lying on its side, sometimes standing on end like a mast, rolled and pitched frightfully. Near 5 o'clock a torrential rain fell, but it lulled neither wind nor sea. The hurricane was unleashed at a speed of 45 meters per second, hence almost 40 leagues per hour. Under these conditions houses topple, roof tiles puncture doors, iron railings snap in two, and 24-pounder cannons relocate. And yet in the midst of this turmoil the Nautilus lived up to that saying of an expert engineer: "A well-constructed hull can defy any sea." This submersible was no resisting rock that waves could demolish. It was a steel spindle, obediently in motion, without rigging or masting, and able to brave their fury with impunity. Meanwhile I was carefully examining these unleashed breakers. They measured up to 15 meters in height, over a length of 150 to 175 meters, and the speed of their propagation, half that of the wind, was 15 meters per second. Their volume and power increased with the depth of the waters. I then understood the role played by these waves, which trap air in their flanks and release it in the depths of the sea where its oxygen brings life. Their utmost pressure, it has been calculated, can build to 3,000 kilograms on every square foot of surface they strike. It was such waves in the Hebrides that repositioned a stone block weighing 84,000 pounds. It was their relatives in the tidal wave on December 23, 1854, that toppled part of the Japanese city of Tokyo, then went that same day at 700 kilometers per hour to break on the beaches of America. After nightfall the storm grew in intensity. As in the 1860 cyclone on Reunion Island, the barometer fell to 710 millimeters. At the close of day I saw a big ship passing on the horizon, struggling painfully. It lay, too, at half steam in an effort to hold steady on the waves. It must have been a steamer on one of those lines out of New York to Liverpool or Le Havre. It soon vanished into the shadows. At 10 o'clock in the evening the skies caught on fire. The air was streaked with violent flashes of lightning. I couldn't stand this brightness, but Captain Nemo stared straight at it, as if to inhale the spirit of the storm. A dreadful noise filled the air, a complicated noise made up of the roar of crashing breakers, the howl of the wind, claps of thunder. The wind shifted to every point of the horizon, and the cyclone left the east to return there after passing through north, west, and south, moving in the opposite direction of revolving storms in the southern hemisphere. Oh, that Gulf Stream! It truly lives up to its nickname, the Lord of Storms. All by itself it creates these fearsome cyclones through the difference in temperature between its currents and the superimposed layers of air. The rain was followed by a downpour of fire. Droplets of water changed into exploding tufts. You would have thought Captain Nemo was courting a death worthy of himself, seeking to be struck by lightning. In one hideous pitching movement the Nautilus reared its steel spur into the air like a lightning rod, and I saw long sparks shoot down it. Shattered, at the end of my strength, I slid flat on my belly to the hatch. I opened it and went below to the lounge. By then the storm had reached its maximum intensity. It was impossible to stand upright inside the Nautilus. Captain Nemo re-entered near midnight. I could hear the ballast tanks filling little by little, and the Nautilus sank gently beneath the surface of the waves. Through the lounge's open windows I saw large frightened fish passing like phantoms in the fiery waters. Some were struck by lightning right before my eyes. The Nautilus kept descending. I thought it would find calm again at 15 meters down. No, the upper strata were too violently agitated. It needed to sink to 50 meters, searching for a resting place in the bowels of the sea. But once there, what tranquillity we found! What silence! What peace all around us! Who would have known that a dreadful hurricane was then unleashed on the surface of this ocean? End of Chapter 19.
Chapter 20. In latitude 47 degrees 24 minutes, and longitude 17 degrees 28 minutes. In the aftermath of this storm, we were thrown back to the east. Away went any hope of escaping to the landing places of New York or the St. Lawrence. In despair, poor Ned went into seclusion like Captain Nemo. Conseil and I no longer left each other. As I said, the Nautilus veered to the east. To be more accurate, I should have said to the northeast. Sometimes on the surface of the waves, sometimes beneath them, the ship wandered for days amid these mists so feared by navigators. These are caused chiefly by melting ice, which keeps the air extremely damp. How many ships have perished in these waterways as they tried to get directions from the hazy lights on the coast? How many casualties have been caused by these opaque mists? How many collisions have occurred with these reefs, where the breaking surf is covered by the noise of the wind? How many vessels have rammed each other? Despite their running lights, despite the warnings given by their bosun's pipes and the alarm bells. So the floor of this sea had the appearance of a battlefield, where every ship defeated by the ocean lay still. Some already old and encrusted, others newer and reflecting our beacon light on their ironwork and copper undersides. Among these vessels, how many went down with all hands, with their crews and hosts of immigrants? At these trouble spots so prominent in the statistics, Cape Race, St. Paul Island, the Strait of Belle Isle, the St. Lawrence Estuary, and in only a few years how many victims have been furnished to the obituary notices by the Royal Mail, Inman, and Montreal lines, by vessels named the Solway, the Isis, the Parramatta, the Hungarian, the Canadian, the Anglo-Saxon, the Humboldt, and the United States, all run aground, by the Arctic and the Lionesses, sunk in collisions, by the President, the Pacific, and the city of Glasgow, lost for unknown reasons in the midst of their gloomy rubble, the Nautilus navigated, as if it were passing the dead in review. By May 15th, we were off the southern tip of the Great Banks of Newfoundland. These banks are the result of marine sedimentation, an extensive accumulation of organic waste brought either from the equator by the Gulf Stream's current or from the North Pole by the countercurrent of cold water that skirts the American coast. Here, too, erratically drifting chunks collect from the ice breakup. Here, a huge boneyard forms from fish, mollusks, and zoophytes, dying over it by the billions. The sea is of no great depth at the Great Banks, a few hundred fathoms at best. But to the south there is a deep, suddenly occurring depression, a 3,000-meter pit. Here the Gulf Stream widens. Its waters come to full blossom. It loses its speed and temperature, but turns into a sea. Among the fish that the Nautilus startled along its way, I'll mention a 1-meter lumpfish, blackish on top with an orange belly, and rare among its brethren in that it practices monogamy. A good-sized eelpout, a type of emerald moray whose flavor is excellent. Wolfish, with big eyes and a head that somewhat resembles a canine's. Viviparous blennies, whose eggs hatch inside their bodies like those of snakes. Bloated gobio, or black gudgeon, measuring 2 decimeters. Grenadiers, with long tails and gleaming with a silvery glow. Speedy fish venturing far from their high Arctic seas. Our nets also hauled in a bold, daring, vigorous, and muscular fish armed with prickles on its head and stings on its fins. A real scorpion measuring 2 to 3 meters, the ruthless enemy of a cod, blennies, and salmon. It was the bullhead of the northerly seas, a fish with red fins and a brown body covered with nodules. The Nautilus's fishermen had some trouble getting a grip on this animal, which, thanks to the formation of its gill covers, can protect its respiratory organs from any parching contact with air and can live out of water for a good while. And I'll mention, for the record, some little banded blennies that follow ships into the northernmost seas, sharp-snouted carp exclusive to the North Atlantic, scorpion fish, and lastly, the goad family, chiefly the cod species, which I detected in their waters of choice over these inexhaustible Grand Banks. Because Newfoundland is simply an underwater peak, you could call these cod mountain fish. While the Nautilus was clearing a path through their tight ranks, Consul couldn't refrain from making this comment. "Mercy, look at these cod," he said. "Why, I thought cod were flat, like dab or sole." "Innocent boy," I exclaimed. "Cod are only flat at the grocery store when they're cut open and spread out on display. But in the water they're like mullet, spindle-shaped and perfectly built for speed." "I can easily believe, master," Consul replied. "But what crowds of them! What swarms!" "Bah, my friend, there'd be many more without their enemies, scorpion fish and human beings. Do you know how many eggs have been counted in a single female?" "I'll go all out," Consul replied. 500,000. 11 million, my friend. 11 million. I refuse to accept that until I count them myself. So count them, Consul. But it would be less work to believe me. Besides, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Americans, Danes, and Norwegians catch these cod by the thousands. They're eaten in prodigious quantities, and without the astounding fertility of these fish, the seas would soon be depopulated of them. Accordingly, in England and America alone, 5,000 ships manned by 75,000 seamen go after cod. Each ship brings back an average catch of 4,400 fish, making 22 million off the coast of Norway. The total is the same. Fine, Consul replied. I'll take the master's word for it. I won't count them. Count what? Those 11 million eggs. But I'll make one comment. What's that? If all their eggs hatched, just 4 codfish could feed England, America, and Norway. As we skimmed the depths of the Great Banks, I could see perfectly those long fishing lines, each armed with 200 hooks that every boat dangled by the dozens. The lower end of each line dragged the bottom by means of a small grappling iron, and at the surface it was secured to a buoy rope of a cork float. The Nautilus had to maneuver shrewdly in the midst of this underwater spiderweb. But the ship didn't stay long in these heavily traveled waters. It went up to about latitude 42 degrees. This brought it abreast of St. John's in Newfoundland and Heart's Continent, where the Atlantic cable reaches its end point. Instead of continuing north, the Nautilus took an easterly heading, as if to go along this plateau on which the telegraph cable rests, where multiple soundings have given the contours of the terrain with the utmost accuracy. It was on May 17th, about 500 miles from Heart's Continent, and about 2,800 meters down, that I spotted this cable lying on the sea floor. Consul, whom I hadn't alerted, mistook it at first for a gigantic sea snake, and was gearing up to classify it in his best manner. But I enlightened him, the fine lad, and let him down gently by giving him various details on the laying of this cable. The first cable was put down during the years 1857 to 1858, but after transmitting about 400 telegrams, it went dead. In 1863, engineers built a new cable that measured 3,400 kilometers, weighing 4,500 metric tons, and was shipped aboard the Great Eastern. This attempt also failed. Now then, on May 25th, while submerged to a depth of 3,836 meters, the Nautilus lay in precisely the locality where this second cable suffered the rupture that ruined the undertaking. It happened 638 miles from the coast of Ireland. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, all contact with Europe broke off. The electricians on board decided to cut the cable before fishing it up, and by 11 o'clock that evening they had retrieved the damaged part. They repaired the joint and its splice. Then the cable was resubmerged, but a few days later it snapped again and couldn't be recovered from the ocean depths. The Americans refused to give up. The daring Cypress Field, who had risked his whole fortune to promote this undertaking, called for a new bond issue. It sold out immediately. Another cable was put down under better conditions. Its sheaves of conducting wire were insulated with a gutta-percha covering, which was protected by a padding of textile material enclosed in a metal sheath. The Great Eastern put back to sea on July 13, 1866. The operations proceeded apace. Yet there was one hitch. As they gradually unrolled this third cable, the electricians observed on several occasions that someone had recently driven nails into it, trying to damage its core. Captain Anderson, his officers, and the engineers put their heads together, then posted a warning that if the culprit were detected, he would be thrown overboard without a trial. After that, these villainous attempts were not repeated. By July 23rd, the Great Eastern was lying no further than 800 kilometers from Newfoundland when it received telegraphed news from Ireland of an armistice signed between Prussia and Austria after the Battle of Sadova. Through the mists, on the 27th, it sighted the port of Heart's Content. The undertakings had ended happily, and in its first dispatch, young America addressed old Europe with these wise words so rarely understood: "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of good will." I didn't expect to find this electric cable in mint condition, as it looked on leaving its place of manufacture. The long snake was covered with seashell rubble and bristling with foraminifera. A crust of caked gravel protected it from any mollusks that might bore into it. It rested serenely, sheltered from the sea's motions, under a pressure favorable to the transmission of what electric spark that goes from America to Europe in 32/100ths of a second. This cable will no doubt last indefinitely, because, as observers note, its gutta-percha casing is improved by a stay in salt water. Besides, on this well-chosen plateau, the cable never lies at depths that could cause a break. The Nautilus followed it to its lowest reaches, located 4,431 meters down, and even there it rested without any stress or strain. Then we returned to the locality where the 1863 accident had taken place. There, the ocean floor formed a valley 120 kilometers wide, into which you could fit Mount Blanc, without its summit poking above the surface of the waves. This valley is closed off to the east by a sheer wall 2,000 meters high. We arrived there on May 28th, and the Nautilus lay no farther than 150 kilometers from Ireland. Would Captain Nemo head up north and beach us on the British Isles? No. Much to my surprise, he went back down south and returned to European seas. As we swung around the Emerald Isle, I spotted Cape Clear for an instant, plus the lighthouse on Fastnet Rock that guides all those thousands of ships setting out from Glasgow or Liverpool. An important question then popped into my head. Would the Nautilus dare to tackle the English Channel? Ned Land, who promptly reappeared after we hugged shore, never stopped questioning me. What could I answer him? Captain Nemo remained invisible. After giving the Canadian a glimpse of American shores, was he about to show me the coast of France? But the Nautilus kept gravitating southward. On May 30th, in sight of Land's End, it passed between the lowermost tip of England and the Scilly Islands, which it left behind to starboard. If it was going to enter the English Channel, it clearly needed to head east. It did not. All day long, on May 31st, the Nautilus swept around the sea in a series of circles that had me deeply puzzled. It seemed to be searching for a locality that it had some trouble finding. At noon, Captain Nemo himself came to take our bearings. He didn't address a word to me. He looked gloomier than ever. What was filling him with such sadness? Was it our proximity to these European shores? Was he reliving his memories of that country he had left behind? If so, what did he feel? Remorse or regret? For a good while these thoughts occupied my mind, and I had a hunch that fate would soon give away the captain's secrets. The next day, June 1st, the Nautilus kept to the same tack. It was obviously trying to locate some precise spot in the ocean. Just as on the day before, Captain Nemo came to take the altitude of the sun. The sea was smooth, the skies clear. 8 miles to the east, a big steamship was visible on the horizon line. No flag was flapping from the gaff of its fore and aft sail, and I couldn't tell its nationality. A few minutes before the sun passed its zenith, Captain Nemo raised his sextant and took his sights with the utmost precision. The absolute calm of the waves facilitated this operation. The Nautilus lay motionless, neither rolling nor pitching. I was on the platform just then. After determining our position, the captain pronounced only these words, "It's right here." He went down the hatch. Had he seen that vessel change course and seemingly head towards us? I'm unable to say. I returned to the lounge. The hatch closed, and I heard water hissing in the ballast tanks. The Nautilus began to sink on a vertical line because its propeller was in check and no longer furnished any forward motion. Some minutes later, it stopped at a depth of 833 meters and came to rest on the seafloor. The ceiling lights in the lounge then went out. The panels opened, and through the windows I saw, for a half-mile radius, the sea brightly lit by the beacon's rays. I looked to port and saw nothing but the immenseness of these tranquil waters. To the starboard, a prominent bulge on the sea bottom caught my attention. You would have thought it was some ruin enshrouded in a crust of whitened seashells, as if under a mantle of snow. Carefully examining this mass, I could identify the swollen outlines of a ship shorn of its masts, which must have sunk bow first. This casualty certainly dated from some far-off time. To be so caked with limestone of these waters, this wreckage must have spent many a year on the ocean floor. What ship was this? Why had the Nautilus come to visit its grave? Was it something other than a maritime accident that had dragged this craft under the waters? I wasn't sure what to think, but next to me I heard Captain Nemo's voice slowly say, "Originally, this ship was christened the Marsalis. It carried 74 cannons and was launched in 1762. On August 13th, 1778, commanded by La Poype Veratreau, it fought valiantly against the Preston. On July 4th, 1779, as a member of the squadron under Admiral d'Estaing, it assisted in the capture of the island of Grenada. On September 5th, 1781, under the Count de Grasse, it took part in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. In 1794, the new Republic of France changed the name of the ship. On April 16th of that same year, it joined the squadron at Brest under Rear Admiral Villaret de Joyce, who was entrusted with escorting a convoy of wheat coming from America under the command of Admiral Van Stabel. In the second year of the French Revolutionary calendar, on the 11th and 12th days of the month of Pasteur, this squadron fought an encounter with English vessels. Sir, today is June 1st, 1868, or the 13th day in the month of Pasteur, 74 years ago to the day, at this very spot in latitude 47 degrees 24 minutes and longitude 17 degrees 28 minutes, this ship sank after heroic battle. Its 3 masts gone, water in its hold, a third of its crew out of action. It preferred to go to the bottom with its 356 seamen rather than surrender, and with its flag nailed up on the afterdeck, it disappeared beneath the waves to shouts of, "Long live the Republic!" "This is the Avenger!" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir, the Avenger. A splendid name," Captain Nemo murmured, crossing his arms. End of recording. End of Chapter 20.
Chapter 21. A Mass Execution. The way he said this, the unexpectedness of this scene, first the biography of this patriotic ship, then the excitement with which this eccentric individual pronounced these last words, the name Avenger, whose significance could not escape me, all this, taken together, had a profound impact on my mind. My eyes never left the captain, hands outstretched toward the sea. He contemplated the proud wreck with blazing eyes. Perhaps I would never learn who he was, where he came from, or where he was heading. But more and more I could see a distinction between the man and the scientist. It was no ordinary misanthropy that kept Captain Nemo and his companions sequestered inside the Nautilus's plating, but a hate so monstrous or so sublime that the passing years could never weaken it. Did this hate also hunger for vengeance? Time would soon tell. Meanwhile, the Nautilus rose slowly to the surface of the sea, and I watched the Avenger's murky shape disappearing little by little. Soon a gentle rolling told me that we were afloat in the open air. Just then a hollow explosion was audible. I looked at the captain. The captain did not stir. "Captain?" I said. He didn't reply. I left him and climbed onto the platform. Conseil and the Canadian were already there. "What caused that explosion?" I asked. "A cannon going off," Ned Land replied. I stared in the direction of the ship I had spotted. It was heading toward the Nautilus, and you could tell it had put on steam. 6 miles separated it from us. "What sort of craft is it, Ned?" "From its rigging and its low masts," the Canadian replied, "I bet it's a warship. Here's hoping it pulls up and sinks this damned Nautilus." "Ned, my friend," Conseil replied, "what harm could it do the Nautilus? Will it attack us under the waves? Will it cannonade us at the bottom of the sea?" "Tell me, Ned," I asked, "can you make out the nationality of that craft?" Creasing his brow, lowering his lids, and puckering the corners of his eyes, the Canadian focused the full power of his gaze on the ship for a short while. "No, sir," he replied. "I can't make out what nation it's from. It's flying no flag. But I'll swear it's a warship, because there's a long pennant streaming from the peak of its mainmast." For a quarter of an hour we continued to watch the craft bearing down on us. But it was inconceivable to me that it had discovered the Nautilus at such a distance, still less that it knew what this underwater machine really was. Soon the Canadian announced that the craft was a big battleship, a double-decker ironclad complete with ram. Dark, dense smoke burst from its 2 funnels. Its furled sails merged with the lines of its yardarms. The gaff of its fore and aft sail flew no flag. Its distance still kept us from distinguishing the colors of its pennant, which was fluttering like a thin ribbon. It was coming on fast. If Captain Nemo let it approach, a chance for salvation might be available to us. "Sir," Ned Land told me, "if that boat gets within a mile of us, I'm jumping overboard, and I suggest you follow suit." I didn't reply to the Canadian's proposition, but kept watching the ship, which was looming larger on the horizon. Whether it was English, French, American, or Russian, it would surely welcome us aboard if we could just get to it. "Master may recall," Conseil then said, "that we have some experience with swimming. He can rely on me to tow him to that vessel, if he's agreeable to going with our friend Ned." Before I could reply, white smoke streamed from the battleship's bow. Then, a few seconds later, the waters splashed astern of the Nautilus, disturbed by the fall of a heavy object. Soon after, an explosion struck my ears. "What's this? They're firing at us?" I exclaimed. "Good lads," the Canadian muttered. "That means they don't see us as castaways clinging to some wreckage." "With all due respect to Master—" "Gracious!" Conseil put in, shaking off the water that had sprayed over him from another shell. "With all due respect to Master, they've discovered the narwhale, and they're cannoning the same." "But it must be clear to them," I exclaimed, "that they're dealing with human beings." "Maybe that's why," Ned Land replied, staring hard at me. The full truth dawned on me. Undoubtedly, people now knew where they stood on the existence of this so-called monster. Undoubtedly, the latter's encounter with the Abraham Lincoln, when the Canadian hit it with his harpoon, had led Commander Farragut to recognize the narwhale as actually an underwater boat, more dangerous than any unearthly cetacean. Yes, this had to be the case, and undoubtedly they were now chasing this dreadful engine of destruction on every sea. Dreadful indeed, if, as we could imagine, Captain Nemo had been using the Nautilus in works of vengeance. That night, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, when he imprisoned us in the cell, hadn't he attacked some ship? That man now buried in the coral cemetery, wasn't he the victim of some collision caused by the Nautilus? Yes, I repeat, this had to be the case. One part of Captain Nemo's secret life had been unveiled. And now, even though his identity was still unknown, at least the nations allied against him knew they were no longer hunting some fairy-tale monster, but a man who had sworn an implacable hate toward them. This whole fearsome sequence of events appeared in my mind's eye. Instead of encountering friends on this approaching ship, we would find only pitiless enemies. Meanwhile, shells fell around us in increasing numbers. Some, meeting the liquid surface, would ricochet and vanish into the sea at considerable distances, but none of them reached the Nautilus. By then the ironclad was no more than 3 miles off. Despite its violent cannonade, Captain Nemo hadn't appeared on the platform. And yet, if one of those conical shells had scored a routine hit on the Nautilus's hull, it could have been fatal to him. The Canadian then told me, "Sir, we've got to do everything we can to get out of this jam. Let's signal them. Damnation! Maybe they'll realize we're decent people." Ned Land pulled out his handkerchief to wave it in the air, but he had barely unfolded it when he was felled by an iron fist, and, despite his great strength, he tumbled to the deck. "Scum!" the captain shouted. "Do you want to be nailed to the Nautilus's spur before it charges that ship?" Dreadful to hear, Captain Nemo was even more dreadful to see. His face was pale from some spasm of his heart, which must have stopped beating for an instant. His pupils were hideously contracted. His voice was no longer speaking. It was bellowing. Bending from the waist, he shook the Canadian by the shoulders. Then, dropping Ned and turning to the battleship, whose shells were showering around him. "Oh, ship of an accursed nation, you know who I am!" he shouted in his powerful voice, "and I don't need your colors to recognize you. Look! I'll show you mine!" And in the bow of the platform Captain Nemo unfurled a black flag, like the one he had left planted at the South Pole. Just then a shell hit the Nautilus's hull obliquely, failed to breach it, ricocheted near the captain, and vanished into the sea. Captain Nemo shrugged his shoulders. Then, addressing me, "Go below," he told me in a curt tone. "You and your companions go below." "Sir," I exclaimed, "are you going to attack this ship?" "Sir, I'm going to sink it." "You wouldn't." "I will," Captain Nemo replied icily. "You're ill-advised to pass judgment on me, sir. Fate has shown you what you weren't meant to see. The attack has come. Our reply will be dreadful. Get back inside. From what country is that ship? You don't know? Fine, so much the better. At least its nationality will remain a secret to you. Go below. The Canadian, Conseil, and I could only obey. Some 15 of the Nautilus's seamen surrounded their captain and stared with a feeling of implacable hate at the ship bearing down on them. You could feel the same spirit of vengeance enkindling their every soul. I went below just as another projectile scraped the Nautilus's hull, and I heard the captain exclaim, "Shoot, you demented vessel! Shower your futile shells! You won't escape the Nautilus's spur! But this isn't the place where you'll perish. I don't want your wreckage mingling with that of the Avenger." I repaired to my stateroom. The captain and his chief officer stayed on the platform. The propeller was set in motion. The Nautilus swiftly retreated, putting us outside the range of the vessel's shells. But the chase continued, and Captain Nemo was content to keep his distance. Near 4 o'clock in the afternoon, unable to control the impatience and uneasiness devouring me, I went back to the central companionway. The hatch was open. I ventured onto the platform. The captain was still strolling there, his steps agitated. He stared at the ship, which stayed to his leeward 5 or 6 miles off. He was circling it like a wild beast, drawing it eastward, letting it chase after him, yet he didn't attack. Was he, perhaps, still undecided? I tried to intervene one last time, but I had barely queried Captain Nemo when the latter silenced me. "I'm the law. I'm the tribunal. I'm the oppressed, and there are my oppressors. Thanks to them, I've witnessed the destruction of everything I loved, cherished, and venerated. Homeland, wife, children, father, and mother. There lies everything I hate. Not another word out of you." I took a last look at the battleship, which was putting on steam. Then I rejoined Ned and Conseil. "We'll escape," I exclaimed. "Good," Ned put in. "Where's that ship from?" "I've no idea, but wherever it's from, it will sink before nightfall. In any event, it's better to perish with it than be accomplices in some act of revenge whose merits we can't gauge." "That's my feeling," Ned Land replied coolly. "Let's wait for nightfall." Night fell. A profound silence reigned on board. The compass indicated that the Nautilus hadn't changed direction. I could hear the beat of its propeller churning the waves with steady speed. Staying on the surface of the water, it rolled gently, sometimes to one side, sometimes to the other. My companions and I had decided to escape as soon as the vessel came close enough for us to be heard, or seen, because the moon would wax full in 3 days and was shining brightly. Once we were aboard that ship, if we couldn't ward off the blow that threatened it, at least we could do everything that circumstances permitted. Several times I thought the Nautilus was about to attack, but it was content to let its adversary approach, and then it would quickly resume its retreating ways. Part of the night passed without incident. We kept watch for an opportunity to take action. We talked little, being too keyed up. Ned Land was all for jumping overboard. I forced him to wait. As I saw it, the Nautilus would attack the double-decker on the surface of the waves, and then it would be not only possible, but easy to escape. At 3 o'clock in the morning, full of uneasiness, I climbed onto the platform. Captain Nemo hadn't left it. He stood in the bow next to his flag, which a mild breeze was unfurling above his head. His eyes never left that vessel. The extraordinary intensity of his gaze seemed to attract it, beguile it, and draw it more surely than if he had it in tow. The moon had then passed its zenith. Jupiter was rising in the east. In the midst of this placid, natural setting, sky and ocean competed with each other in tranquillity, and the sea offered the orb of night the loveliest mirror ever to reflect its image. and when I compared this deep calm of the elements with all the fury seething inside the plating of this barely perceptible Nautilus, I shivered all over. The vessel was 2 miles off. It drew nearer, always moving toward the phosphorescent glow that signaled the Nautilus's presence. I saw its green and red running lights, plus the white lantern hanging from the large stay of its foremast. Hazy flickerings were reflected on its rigging and indicated that its furnaces were pushed to the limit. Showers of sparks and cinders of flaming coal escaped from its funnels, spangling the air with stars. I stood there until 6 o'clock in the morning, Captain Nemo never seeming to notice me. The vessel lay 1.5 miles off, and with the first glimmers of daylight it resumed its cannonade. The time couldn't be far away when the Nautilus would attack its adversary, and my companions and I would leave forever this man I dared not judge. I was about to go below to alert them, when the chief officer climbed onto the platform. Several seamen were with him. Captain Nemo didn't see them or didn't want to see them. They carried out certain procedures that, on the Nautilus, you could call clearing the decks for action. They were quite simple. The man-ropes that formed a handrail around the platform were lowered. Likewise, the pilot-house and the beacon housing were withdrawn into the hull until they lay exactly flush with it. The surface of this long sheet-iron cigar no longer offered a single protrusion that could hamper its maneuvers. I returned to the lounge. The Nautilus still emerged above the surface. A few morning gleams infiltrated the liquid strata. Beneath the undulations of the billows, the windows were enlivened by the blushing of the rising sun. That dreadful day of June 2 had dawned. At 7 o'clock, the log told me that the Nautilus had reduced speed. I realized that it was letting the warship approach. Moreover, the explosions grew more intensely audible. Shells furrowed the water around us, drilling through it with an odd hissing sound. "My friends," I said, "it's time. Let's shake hands, and may God be with us." Ned Land was determined, Conseil calm, I myself nervous and barely in control. We went into the library. Just as I pushed open the door leading to the well of the central companionway, I heard the hatch close sharply overhead. The Canadian leaped up the steps, but I stopped him. A well-known hissing told me that water was entering the ship's ballast tanks. Indeed, in a few moments the Nautilus had submerged some meters below the surface of the waves. I understood this maneuver. It was too late to take action. The Nautilus wasn't going to strike the double-decker where it was clad in impenetrable iron armor, but below its waterline, where the metal carapace no longer protected its planking. We were prisoners once more, unwilling spectators at the performance of this gruesome drama. But we barely had time to think. Taking refuge in my stateroom, we stared at each other without pronouncing a word. My mind was in a total daze. My mental processes came to a dead stop. I hovered in that painful state that predominates during the period of anticipation before some frightful explosion. I waited, I listened, I lived only through my sense of hearing. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's speed had increased appreciably, so it was gathering momentum. Its entire hull was vibrating. Suddenly I let out a yell. There had been a collision, but it was comparatively mild. I could feel the penetrating force of the steel spur. I could hear scratchings and scrapings. Carried away with its driving power, the Nautilus had passed through the vessel's mast like a sailmaker's needle through canvas. I couldn't hold still. Frantic, going insane, I leaped out of my stateroom and rushed into the lounge. Captain Nemo was there. Mute, gloomy, implacable, he was staring through the port panel. An enormous mass was sinking beneath the waters, and the Nautilus, missing none of its death throes, was descending into the depths with it. 10 meters away, I could see its gaping hull, into which water was rushing with a sound of thunder, then its double rows of cannons and railings. Its deck was covered with dark, quivering shadows. The water was rising. Those poor men leaped up into the shrouds, clung to the masts, writhed beneath the waters. It was a human ant-hill that an invading sea had caught by surprise. Paralyzed, rigid with anguish, my hair standing on end, my eyes popping out of my head, short of breath, suffocating, speechless, I stared. I, too. I was glued to the window by an irresistible allure. The enormous vessel settled slowly. Following it down, the Nautilus kept watch on its every movement. Suddenly there was an eruption. The air compressed inside the craft sent its decks flying, as if the powder stores had been ignited. The thrust of the waters was so great the Nautilus swerved away. The poor ship then sank more swiftly. Its mastheads appeared, laden with victims, then its crosstrees bending under clusters of men, finally the peak of its mainmast. Then the dark mass disappeared, and with it a crew of corpses dragged under by fearsome eddies. I turned to Captain Nemo. This dreadful executioner, this true archangel of hate, was still staring. When it was all over, Captain Nemo headed to the door of his stateroom, opened it, and entered. I followed him with my eyes. On the rear paneling, beneath the portraits of his heroes, I saw the portrait of a still youthful woman with 2 little children. Captain Nemo stared at them for a few moments, stretched out his arms to them, sank to his knees, and melted into sobs. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. The Last Words of Captain Nemo. The panels closed over this frightful view, but the lights didn't go on in the lounge. Inside the Nautilus all was gloom and silence. It left this place of devastation with prodigious speed, 100 feet beneath the waters. Where was it going? North or south? Where would the man flee after this horrible act of revenge? I re-entered my stateroom, where Ned and Conseil were waiting silently. Captain Nemo filled me with insurmountable horror. Whatever he had once suffered at the hands of humanity, he had no right to mete out such punishment. He had made me, if not an accomplice, at least an eyewitness to his vengeance. Even this was intolerable. At 11 o'clock, the electric lights came back on. I went into the lounge. It was deserted. I consulted the various instruments. The Nautilus was fleeing northward at a speed of 25 miles per hour, sometimes on the surface of the sea, sometimes 30 feet beneath it. After our position had been marked on the chart, I saw that we were passing into the mouth of the English Channel, that our heading would take us to the northernmost seas with incomparable speed. I could barely glimpse the swift passing of long-nosed sharks, hammerhead sharks, spotted dogfish that frequent these waters, big eagle rays, swarms of seahorse looking like knights on a chessboard, eels quivering like fireworks serpents, armies of crab that fled obliquely by crossing their pincers over their carapaces, finally schools of porpoise that held contests of speed with the Nautilus. But by this point observing, studying, and classifying were out of the question. By evening we had cleared 200 leagues up the Atlantic. Shadows gathered and gloom overran the sea until the moon came up. I repaired to my stateroom. I couldn't sleep. I was assaulted by nightmares. That horrible scene of destruction kept repeating in my mind's eye. From that day forward, who knows where the Nautilus took us in the North Atlantic basin? Always at incalculable speed. Always amid the high Arctic mists. Did it call at the capes of Spitzbergen or the shores of Novaya Zemlya? Did it visit such uncharted seas as the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Gulf of Ob, the Lyakov Islands, or those unknown beaches on the Siberian coast? I'm unable to say. I lost track of the passing hours. Time was in abeyance on the ship's clocks. As happens in the polar regions, it seemed that night and day no longer followed their normal sequence. I felt myself being drawn into that strange domain where the overwrought imagination of Edgar Allan Poe was at home. Like his fabled Arthur Gordon Pym, I expected any moment to see that shrouded human figure, very far larger in its proportions than any dweller among men, thrown across the cataract that protects the outskirts of the pole. I estimate, but perhaps I'm mistaken, that the Nautilus's haphazard course continued for 15 or 20 days, and I'm not sure how long this would have gone on without the catastrophe that ended our voyage. As for Captain Nemo, he was no longer in the picture. As for his chief officer, the same applied. Not one crewman was visible for a single instant. The Nautilus cruised beneath the waters almost continuously. When it rose briefly to the surface to renew our air, the hatches opened and closed as if automated. No more positions were reported on the world map. I didn't know where we were. I'll also mention that the Canadian, at the end of his strength and patience, made no further appearances. Conseil couldn't coax a single word out of him, and feared that, in a fit of delirium while under the sway of a ghastly homesickness, Ned would kill himself. So he kept a devoted watch on his friend every instant. You can appreciate that under these conditions our situation had become untenable. One morning, whose date I'm unable to specify, I was slumbering near the first hours of daylight, a painful, sickly slumber. Waking up, I saw Ned Land leaning over me, and I heard him tell me in a low voice, "We're going to escape." I sat up. "When?" I asked. "Tonight. There doesn't seem to be any supervision left on the Nautilus. You'd think a total daze was reigning on board. Will you be ready, sir?" "Yes. Where are we?" "In sight of land. I saw it through the mists just this morning, 20 miles to the east." "What land is it?" "I've no idea, but whatever it is, there we'll take refuge." "Yes, Ned, we'll escape tonight, even if the sea swallows us up." "The sea's rough, the wind's blowing hard, but a 20-mile run in the Nautilus's nimble longboat doesn't scare me. Unknown to the crew, I've stowed some food and flasks of water inside." "I'm with you." "What's more," the Canadian added, "if they catch me, I'll defend myself. I'll fight to the death." "Then we'll die together, Ned, my friend." My mind was made up. The Canadian left me. I went out on the platform where I could barely stand upright against the jolts of the billows. The skies were threatening, but land lay inside those dense mists, and we had to escape. Not a single day or even a single hour could we afford to lose. I returned to the lounge, dreading yet desiring an encounter with Captain Nemo, wanting yet not wanting to see him. What would I say to him? How could I hide the involuntary horror he inspired in me? No. It was best not to meet him face to face, best to try and forget him. And yet... How long that day seemed, the last I would spend aboard the Nautilus. I was left to myself. Ned Land and Conseil avoided speaking to me, afraid they would give themselves away. At 6 o'clock I ate supper, but I had no appetite. Despite my revulsion, I forced it down, wanting to keep my strength up. At 6:30 Ned Land entered my stateroom. He told me, "We won't see each other again before we go. At 10 o'clock the moon won't be up yet. We'll take advantage of the darkness. Come to the skiff. Conseil and I will be inside waiting for you." The Canadian left without giving me time to answer him. I wanted to verify the Nautilus's heading. I made my way to the lounge. We were racing north-northeast with frightful speed, 50 meters down. I took one last look at the natural wonders and artistic treasures amassed in the museum, this unrivaled collection doomed to perish some day in the depths of the seas, together with its curator. I wanted to establish one supreme impression in my mind. I stayed there an hour, basking in the aura of the ceiling lights, passing in review the treasures shining in their glass cases. Then I returned to my stateroom. There I dressed in sturdy seafaring clothes. I gathered my notes and packed them tenderly about my person. My heart was pounding mightily. I couldn't curb its pulsations. My anxiety and agitation would certainly have given me away if Captain Nemo had seen me. What was he doing just then? I listened at the door to his stateroom. I heard the sound of footsteps. Captain Nemo was inside. He hadn't gone to bed. With his every movement, I imagined he would appear and ask me why I wanted to escape. I felt in a perpetual state of alarm. My imagination magnified this sensation. The feeling became so acute, I wondered whether it wouldn't be better to enter the captain's stateroom, dare him face to face, brave it out with word and deed. It was an insane idea. Fortunately, I controlled myself and stretched out on the bed to soothe my bodily agitation. My nerves calmed a little, but with my brain so aroused, I did a swift review of my whole existence aboard the Nautilus. Every pleasant or unpleasant incident that had crossed my path since I went overboard from the Abraham Lincoln. The underwater hunting trip, the Torres Strait, our running aground, the savages of Papua, the Coral Cemetery, the Suez Passageway, the island of Santorini, the Cretan Diver, the Bay of Vigo, Atlantis, the Ice Bank, the South Pole, our imprisonment in the ice, the battle with the devilfish, the storm in the Gulf Stream, the Avenger, and that horrible scene of the vessel sinking with its crew. All these events passed before my eyes like backdrops unrolling upstage in a theater. In this strange setting, Captain Nemo then grew fantastically. His features were accentuated, taking on superhuman proportions. He was no longer my equal. He was the man of the waters, the spirit of the seas. By then it was 9:30. I held my head in both hands to keep it from bursting. I closed my eyes. I no longer wanted to think. A half-hour still to wait. A half-hour of nightmares that could drive me insane. Just then I heard indistinct chords from the organ, melancholy harmonies from some undefinable hymn. Actual pleadings from a soul trying to sever its earthly ties. I listened with all my senses at once, barely breathing, immersed like Captain Nemo in this musical trance that was drawing him beyond the bounds of this world. Then a sudden thought terrified me. Captain Nemo had left his stateroom. He was in the same lounge I had to cross in order to escape. There I would encounter him one last time. He would see me, perhaps speak to me. One gesture from him could obliterate me, a single word shackle me to his vessel. Even so, 10 o'clock was about to strike. It was time to leave my stateroom and rejoin my companions. I dared not hesitate, even if Captain Nemo stood before me. I opened the door cautiously, but as it swung on its hinges it seemed to make a frightful noise. This noise existed perhaps only in my imagination. I crept forward through the Nautilus's dark gangways, pausing after each step to curb the pounding of my heart. I arrived at the corner door of the lounge. I opened it gently. The lounge was plunged in profound darkness. Chords from the organ were reverberating faintly. Captain Nemo was there. He didn't see me. Even in broad daylight I doubt that he would have noticed me, so completely was he immersed in his trance. I inched over the carpet, avoiding the tiniest bump whose noise might give me away. It took me 5 minutes to reach the door at the far end which led into the library. I was about to open it when a gasp from Captain Nemo nailed me to the spot. I realized that he was standing up. I even got a glimpse of him because some rays of light from the library had filtered into the lounge. He was coming toward me, arms crossed, silent, not walking, but gliding like a ghost. His chest was heaving, swelling with sobs, and I heard him murmur these words, the last of his to reach my ears. "Oh, Almighty God! Enough! Enough!" Was it a vow of repentance that had just escaped from this man's conscience? Frantic, I rushed into the library. I climbed the central companionway, and going along the upper gangway, I arrived at the skiff. I went through the opening that had already given access to my two companions. "Let's go! Let's go!" I exclaimed. "Right away," the Canadian replied. First, Ned Land closed and bolted the opening cut into the Nautilus's sheet iron using the monkey wrench he had with him. After likewise closing the opening in the skiff, the Canadian began to unscrew the nuts still bolting us to the underwater boat. Suddenly, a noise from the ship's interior became audible. Voices were answering each other hurriedly. What was it? Had they spotted our escape? I felt Ned Land sliding a dagger into my hand. "Yes," I muttered, "we know how to die." The Canadian paused in his work. But one word, 20 times repeated, one dreadful word told me the reason for the agitation spreading aboard the Nautilus. We weren't the cause of the crew's concern. "Maelstrom! Maelstrom!" they were shouting. The Maelstrom! Could a more frightening name have rung in our ears under more frightening circumstances? Were we lying in the dangerous waterways off the Norwegian coast? Was the Nautilus being dragged into this whirlpool just as the skiff was about to detach from its plating? As you know, at the turn of the tide, the waters confined between the Faroe and Lofoten Islands rush out with irresistible violence. They form a vortex from which no ship has ever been able to escape. Monstrous waves race together from every point of the horizon. They form a whirlpool aptly called the ocean's navel, whose attracting power extends a distance of 15 kilometers. It can suck down not only ships, but whales and even polar bears from the northernmost regions. This was where the Nautilus had been sent accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, by its captain. It was sweeping around in a spiral whose radius kept growing smaller and smaller. The skiff, still attached to the ship's plating, was likewise carried around at dizzying speed. I could feel us whirling. I was experiencing that accompanying nausea that follows such continuous spinning motions. We were in dread, in the last stages of sheer horror, our blood frozen in our veins, our nerves numb, drenched in cold sweat as if from the throes of dying. And what a noise around our frail skiff! What roars echoing from several miles away! What crashes from the water breaking against sharp rocks on the seafloor, where the hardest objects are smashed, where tree trunks are worn down and worked into a shaggy fur, as Norwegians express it. What a predicament! We were rocking frightfully. The Nautilus defended itself like a human being. Its steel muscles were cracking. Sometimes it stood on end, the three of us along with it. "We've got to hold on tight," Ned said, "and screw the nuts down again. If we can stay attached to the Nautilus, we can still make it." He hadn't finished speaking when a cracking sound occurred. The nuts gave way and ripped out of its socket. The skiff was hurled like a stone from a sling into the midst of the vortex. My head struck against an iron timber, and with this violent shock I lost consciousness. End of Chapter 22.
Chapter 23. Conclusion. We come to the conclusion of this voyage under the seas. What happened that night, how the skiff escaped from the Maelstrom's fearsome eddies, how Ned Land, Conseil and I got out of that whirlpool, I'm unable to say. But when I regained consciousness, I was lying in a fisherman's hut on one of the Lofoten Islands. My two companions, safe and sound, were at my bedside, clasping my hands. We embraced each other heartily. Just now we can't even dream of returning to France. Travel between Upper Norway and the south is limited. So I have to wait for the arrival of a steamboat that provides bi-monthly service from North Cape. So it is here, among these gallant people who have taken us in, that I'm reviewing my narrative of these adventures. It is accurate. Not a fact has been omitted, not a detail has been exaggerated. It's the faithful record of this inconceivable expedition into an element now beyond human reach, but where progress will some day make great inroads. Will anyone believe me? I don't know. Ultimately, it's unimportant. What I can now assert is that I've earned the right to speak of these seas, beneath which in less than 10 months I have cleared 20,000 leagues in this underwater tour of the world that has shown me so many wonders across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the southernmost and northernmost seas. But what happened to the Nautilus? Did it withstand the Maelstrom's clutches? Is Captain Nemo alive? Is he still under the ocean, pursuing his frightful program of revenge, or did he stop after that latest mass execution? Will the waves some day deliver the manuscript that contains his full life story? Will I finally learn the man's name? Will the nationality of the stricken warship tell us the nationality of Captain Nemo? I hope so. I likewise hope that his powerful submersible has defeated the sea inside its most dreadful whirlpool, that the Nautilus has survived where so many ships have perished. If this is the case, and Captain Nemo still inhabits the ocean, his adopted country, may the hate be appeased in that fierce heart. May the contemplation of so many wonders extinguish the spirit of vengeance in him. May the executioner pass away, and the scientist continue his peaceful exploration of the seas. If his destiny is strange, it's also sublime. Haven't I encompassed it myself? Didn't I lead 10 months of this otherworldly existence? Thus to that question asked 6,000 years ago in the book of Ecclesiastes, who can fathom the soundless depths? 2 men out of all humanity have now earned the right to reply, Captain Nemo and I. End of the second part, and end of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne.
Thank you for listening to Narrated Books. If you enjoyed this audiobook, hit like and subscribe for more amazing stories. What book should we narrate next? Let us know in the comments.